Robin Falk was a small-town girl with small-town values, and the Oregon native always knew she wanted a traditional life, especially when it came to marriage.
I was raised very conservative, and, marriage was forever.
But in the summer of 1980, Robin was facing a life that was very different from the one she'd dreamed of. At 19 years old, she found herself pregnant, broke, and alone.
My daughter's father was a high school sweetheart, and when I got pregnant, the relationship ended. I didn't want my daughter to go without or be penalized for my mistakes. So it was really important for me to be able to give her everything that she deserved.
That spring, when her daughter Jakelli was 4 weeks old, Robin moved to her family's farm in Richland, Oregon to work for her father. And while Robin was focused on raising her daughter, she did strike up a friendship with a laid-back delivery man named Jerry Joe Wilson.
Jerry was tall and good-looking and very outdoorsy. When he'd come around, I got the little butterflies in my stomach.
The couple hit it off immediately.
Oh, we started dating right away. We had met, in the barn and just kind of started hanging out, going fishing together. We would catfish all night. It was just a done deal.
Robin loved everything about Jerry. But what really made her heart melt was the way he treated her daughter, Jakelli.
She was very happy that he was so good to her daughter. That was really, really important to Robin.
By November 1980, after just 4 months of dating, Robin and Jerry knew they would be spending the rest of their lives together.
We just knew that we were right, and we were going to be married.
And 1 month later, that's exactly what they did.
It was just a really quiet, small church wedding with close family and a couple of friends. It was beautiful. I just felt like I had everything.
The newlyweds moved into their own small home in Richland, and Jerry legally adopted Jakelli. In May 1982, the happy couple welcomed another daughter into the world.
After a couple of years living in Richland, we decided to move into Baker to be closer to Jerry's family. His parents were very welcoming. They actually had an extra house, and so we lived in their house.
It seemed Robin finally had the family she had always wanted. But soon she began to notice a troubling change in her husband's behavior.
Shortly after we moved to Baker, Jerry started not coming home after work. He would be gone overnight. He would be gone all weekend, supposedly fishing or hanging out with his friends. I saw a lot less of Jerry after we moved.
But Robin kept her worries to herself. After all, Jerry was a good provider. He took care of the family's finances, and when he was home, he doted on his 2 little girls. But just 6 years later, Robin's dreams of a happy family life would come crashing down. It all began on March 21st, 1986, when Jerry left home without telling Robin where he was going. He never came back that night.
It was very common for him to disappear without me knowing where he was.
But there was something different about this disappearance. And the next morning, when Robin heard a shocking report on the local news,
I got just this gut ache about it.
She had no idea that a nightmarish chain of events had begun.
Robin had no idea what was going on inside of Jerry's head.
My life changed forever. My life would never be the same after that.
In the summer of 1983, 3 years before Robin Falk's family was rocked by traumatic news, Robin and her husband Jerry were living a quiet life in beautiful Baker City, Oregon.
We were living in the house that Jerry's parents owned, and things were pretty good. He was gone a considerable amount of time, but he was working, and I was home with the kids.
Robin knew they were lucky to have Jerry's family close by. But just 3 years into their marriage, she noticed her mother-in-law acting strange when it came to money.
Well, my mother-in-law didn't drive. She never had. And so she would call and have me come and pick her up and take her to the grocery store. And we'd get to the store, and I would need to pick up a few things. And then we would get to the checkout stand, and she would pay for everything. It became a routine. It went on for quite some time. It was really uncomfortable for me. It was embarrassing because that's something I always took pride in, taking care of myself and being able to put food on the table.
Robin was at a loss, but didn't want to confront her mother-in-law, so she decided to discuss the matter with her husband.
So I asked Jerry about it, why his mom was buying groceries for us. And so I just kept pressing until he finally caved.
Robin was floored by what Jerry said next.
Told me that he didn't have a job, and his brother had been covering for him while he went and played all day. He pretended to work. He left every day. I made him a lunch, packed him a lunch, and he left and didn't have a job.
Even worse, Robin realized Jerry's entire family knew about the lie and had been hiding it from her.
Jerry was the baby. He had a lot of older siblings that always took care of him, and Jerry really couldn't do any wrong.
Robin was livid.
I told him that I wasn't going to live that way. I applied for a job, got it right away. That embarrassed him.
Ashamed, Jerry finally landed a job himself as a delivery driver.
I was hopeful that we'd be okay again.
Robin set about trying to move past her husband's deception. But Jerry's frequent absences from home only heightened her anxiety.
Well, with Jerry gone so much, it did make me wonder what he was up to. And of course, I didn't want to believe anything bad.
But later that summer, when a friend came to her with a disturbing rumor she'd heard around town, Robin was forced to face a heartbreaking reality about her husband.
A gal that I knew told me that he was cheating on me. She took me to the house where she thought that he was at with this gal, and his truck was there. I just wanted to throw up.
Robin immediately banged on the door, ready to confront them both, but no one answered.
I was hurt, I was mad, I had no idea what I was going to even say. If they'd opened the door, I probably would have just melted.
Distraught, Robin went home and waited for Jerry to return. And when he finally showed up later that day, Robin confronted him with what she had seen. But she wasn't at all prepared for Jerry's reaction.
He got very, very mad. He punched a wall and broke his hand. I had never seen him blow like that before. I'd never seen him explode, and I was afraid. I was really afraid.
Robin decided to leave well enough alone and drop the matter. She desperately wanted to keep her family together, despite her husband's disturbing dark streak.
I really didn't think about leaving him at that time. I had 2 little kids. He was a good father. You know, marriages stay together. You don't get married to get divorced.
Robin would have done anything that she could do to make it work.
Over the next few months, that's exactly what Robin set out to do. And in the fall of 1983, Robin discovered she was pregnant again.
I thought maybe having another baby would pull things back together.
But Robin had no idea that the darkness she'd glimpsed in her husband was still simmering, and it would soon explode in a terrifying way.
The more the detectives talked to her, the more they felt something was wrong.
In the summer of 1984, Robin Falk was pregnant with her 3rd child and trying desperately to keep her marriage together. But her husband Jerry didn't seem interested in doing his part.
After our son was born, It was pretty much, life as it was before. He was proud of his son, but didn't really keep him home.
Robin basically was raising those children by herself. She had no support.
Over the next 2 years, Jerry's long absences became increasingly frequent, and his explanations were starting to ring hollow.
I finally came to the point where I just really couldn't take it anymore.
On Friday, March 21st, 1986, Robin cornered Jerry at home and laid out her demands.
I confronted him there, and I told him that I couldn't go on like this anymore, that either something needed to change or I was going to have to leave, and that if I found out that he had cheated on me again, that it would be over. I would be done.
Robin wasn't surprised when her husband got up and left, rather than answer her plea.
I really thought that he was just going to go for a drive and come back.
But Jerry never came home that night. And the next morning, when Robin woke up, her husband was still gone. Robin was more worried about her marriage than ever, but her concerns would soon be overshadowed by a shocking report on the local news.
The news came on every hour on the hour, and they started talking about this lady that was missing from town. I got just this gut ache about it.
When it was first advised that we had a missing woman, we thought we probably had a problem. We don't have people just come up missing. So in this case, we felt it needed to be out to the public to try to get some answers.
The missing woman's name was Beth Williams. Baker City police detectives had been searching for her for 2 days, and they were about to get a surprising lead.
My first really clue came in when a woman that I knew had called me and told me that she had seen Beth leave a bar here in town with a gentleman by the name of Jerry Wilson.
Early Monday morning, police dispatched a detective to Robin and Jerry's house, just as Jerry was arriving back home.
Jerry wasn't in the house more than 2 or 3 minutes, and somebody knocked at the door. It wasn't anybody that I'd seen before.
I introduced myself as a policeman for Baker City, and I just asked Mr. Wilson if he would come down to the station and talk to me. When a policeman shows up at your house at 7:30 in the morning, asks you to come down and talk, first thing you want to know is why. And he didn't say that. I was beginning to wonder then if he probably had something to do with the disappearance of Beth Williams.
While Detective Rogers interviewed Jerry, another investigator contacted Robin and asked her to come to the police station for an interview.
They asked me a bajillion questions, same questions over and over. And they wanted to know if Jerry was home Friday night, when the last time I saw him. But they still hadn't told me why they were asking me all these questions.
After grilling Robin for hours, detectives delivered some chilling news.
First, they asked me if I had heard about this girl that was missing, and I said, yeah, I'd heard about it on the news. And they told me that they believed that Jerry was responsible. And I said, no way. There's no way.
Even worse, police were certain this was much more than a missing persons case.
After talking to him, we was sure that probably something bad had happened.
In March of 1986, Robin Falk received the most shocking news of her life. Baker City police were certain her husband, Jerry Joe Wilson, was suspect number 1 in the disappearance and likely murder of a local woman. Robin was distraught, but she refused to believe a word of it.
They had the wrong person. It wasn't Jerry. They were crazy. He didn't have it in him to do that. After I left the police station, I went back home, and Jerry had come home, and he told me that if the police questioned me, that I need to tell them that he was home Friday night. And I told him that I didn't know what he'd gotten himself into, but I wasn't going to lie for him.
Despite her refusal to lie, Robin was certain her husband was innocent.
My first thought was he did something stupid, like maybe he was speeding and he outran the cops or something silly. He'd never been in trouble with the law, so I couldn't imagine him doing anything very bad.
Robin was just happy to have her husband back at home. And over the next few days, Jerry acted as if nothing had happened. He went to work and came home as usual. He told Robin he had been cooperating with the police and had agreed to take a polygraph.
When he told me that he was going to do the lie detector test, I thought that would be good. You know, he could clear his name and there wouldn't be any more question. It would be over with.
But Robin's hopes would soon be shattered. That Thursday, Jerry took the polygraph test and failed.
Jerry finally called me, and he told me that he had been arrested. And he told me that he had done it, and that he had killed her. Couldn't believe it. I couldn't believe it.
Jerry told her the disturbing story of what had happened the weekend he disappeared. He confessed to having a one-night stand. But then, things had taken a turn for the worse.
He said that he had picked her up in a bar, and they had gone out to my uncle's cabin. And then they got in a big argument. She told him that she knew that he was married, and she would tell his wife. And when he heard that, everything that I had said Friday night came ringing back to him. And he knew that if I found out that I would leave.
And that's when the rage Robin had glimpsed in her husband boiled over.
The argument escalated, and he killed her.
Jerry admitted he had used a rock as his murder weapon.
I was just devastated. I couldn't believe these words were coming out of his mouth. Like, it didn't make sense to me.
I could tell while talking to Jerry that this was bothering his conscience a lot. I told him that the family needed to know where the body of Beth Williams was to put it to rest. And I could see actually a sigh of relief when he finally told me where the body was.
Detectives immediately sent out a search party for the body of Beth Williams.
When they went to the body and the rock was found right there, practically on top of the grave with blood on it, what was found corroborated what he had said.
In April of 1986, Jerry Joe Wilson waived his right to a jury trial and, on the advice of his attorney, pleaded not guilty to second-degree murder. Despite his plea, that June, Jerry was convicted of murdering Beth Williams. He was sentenced to life in prison with a possibility of parole. This time, Jerry's family could do nothing to help him. The months following Jerry's conviction were brutal for Robin and her kids.
My house started being broken into, and I was fired because I was bad for business. Jerry was locked away. He was in jail. I was the only one out there for them to get revenge on. I decided to move, to leave it all behind. I walked away from everything. I lost my house. I left my friends, and I went to a town where nobody knew me.
In June of 1987, Robin's divorce was finalized. Once again a determined single mother, Robin took her children and made a fresh start, ultimately settling in Alaska. Today, Robin is still the same small-town girl at heart. And now, 26 years after Jerry's arrest, she is finally living her small-town dream.
Life now is wonderful. I have 3 beautiful children, 9 grandkids. They are the light of my life. It's wonderful.
Robin believes the experience with Jerry has made her stronger. And that strength is displayed in her ability to move on and trust again.
I'm married to a very wonderful, supporting man. We have this really great relationship. We can go sit out on a boat all day long. And at the end of the day, we're still best friends.
At 20 years old, Audrey Mabry was ready to start a new life for herself.
I had been born and raised in the same town my whole life. I had just come out of a relationship, so I wanted to move out of my hometown and kind of start over.
In April of 2003, the small-town waitress moved from Fort Hood, Texas, to the city of El Paso. A couple weeks later, Audrey found herself home with nothing to do.
I was off from work one day, bored out of my mind, and got onto the computer and just got into a random chat room. I noticed a screen name that popped out to me that was black and bold for you. I had always been attracted to black men, so I clicked on the name.
And Audrey was pleased to discover that the man behind the eye-catching handle was equally interesting. His name was Chris Haney, a New York City police detective and single father of 2.
He said he had been previously engaged and he had 2 children from that relationship.
Chris also told Audrey he was 35 years old, 15 years her senior. But Audrey didn't mind.
I thought to myself, this is a guy that knows where he's going in life and is on the right track.
I think what drew Audrey to Chris was that he was different from her other relationships. This was a stable man with a stable job.
Before long, Chris and Audrey were talking non-stop on the phone. And a few months later, Chris invited Audrey to the Big Apple so they could meet in person.
This was absolutely a crazy idea, but the fact that he was the cop made me feel like I could trust him.
On June 9th, 2003, when Audrey first laid eyes on Chris, she was instantly captivated.
His smile was humongous, the biggest smile I had ever seen in my entire life, and I was immediately drawn to it. He puts his arms around me, and I'd never felt so safe. And I just thought to myself, this is the guy I'm gonna marry.
In October of 2003, Audrey moved to New York to be with her new love. But shortly after Audrey moved in with Chris, he came to her with a confession.
He expressed to me that he was not 35, he was actually 38. I had some concerns about that, but thought to myself, it was kind of silly. It was only 3 years. He wanted to appeal to a younger girl, and that's why he did it.
Audrey let the matter go. There were more exciting things to think about. Her relationship with Chris was flourishing, and she soon met his ex-fiancée and their 2 children. Chris was still on good terms with them, and all 3 accepted Audrey instantly.
It made me feel amazing that they were so welcoming to me, and it gave me hope for our future.
In the fall of 2004, after 1 year of dating, Chris proposed, and Audrey gladly accepted. Just a few months later, the happy couple discovered Audrey was pregnant.
I didn't really want to raise my children in New York City, and I told him I always wanted to live in Florida, so we sort of formulated this plan.
Chris purchased a lovely home for his new family in Apollo Beach, Florida. And in April 2005, Audrey moved in while Chris stayed behind in New York to finish his last year with the police force. On September 10th, 2005, Chris and Audrey welcomed their son into the world.
The long distance was difficult, but Chris would come every 5 weeks to visit, so we would still see each other pretty frequently.
It seemed nothing, not even distance, could stop the couple. Until 4 years later, when Audrey discovered the man she loved was hiding an unimaginable evil. Audrey's nightmare began the afternoon of November 17th, 2009. She had just finished a run and stopped by the house to freshen up.
Chris was not supposed to be home that day.
But Chris was home. And when Audrey opened the front door, she stopped dead in her tracks at the horrifying sight that greeted her.
As soon as I entered, there he was with a butcher knife in his hand and charges at me.
Audrey was terrified, but she had no idea that this was just the beginning.
If he wasn't gonna have her, no one was gonna have her.
I see blood dropping to the floor. And in my mind, I'm like, what the hell is going on right now?
Pressing news.
And it was at a dinner where his sister-in-law asked me if Chris and his wife were divorced yet.
Audrey was confused. Chris had called the mother of his 2 children his ex-fiancée.
I felt betrayed. I felt like I had been living a lie the entire time. I confronted him about it very quickly, and he admitted that not only had he been married, but he was in fact still married.
But Chris insisted that the marriage was in name only, and it was simply to keep their children on his health insurance.
Every part of me was screaming to leave, but I stayed because we hadn't even had an opportunity to be a family yet.
A few months later, Chris finally retired from the police department and joined Audrey and their infant son in Florida.
When Chris came down to Florida, he promised he would get divorced. My hopes from that point on was to make it work.
And over the next few years, that's exactly what the couple did. Chris got a security job, and Audrey juggled plans to go back to school while working part-time at a restaurant.
I started babysitting for Audrey shortly after Malachi was born. They were the best parents. Chris seemed like a loving father who would do anything for his child.
And in the spring of 2008, Chris kept his promise. He finalized his divorce, and Audrey realized she was pregnant again. The happy couple decided it was finally time to tie the knot. Audrey and Chris exchanged vows in the summer of 2008, on the same day they had met 5 years earlier.
I was emotional in the midst of it. I felt like I was fulfilling this dream that I had since I was a child.
6 months after the wedding, Audrey gave birth to another bouncing baby boy. The newlyweds were so proud of their growing family. But Audrey's hopes for a lasting marriage would suddenly come crashing down less than 2 years later. In the fall of 2009, just as Audrey started going back to school, Chris came to her with a disturbing confession that destroyed everything she had tried to build.
He said, "Listen, there's something that I've been hiding from you. I've been gambling." I always knew that Chris enjoys to gamble, and that was always fine with me, as long as he paid every bill that we had.
But Audrey had no idea how much Chris's habit had been costing them.
He had gambled 2 months of the bills away. And I asked him, "Well, what do you mean?" And he said, "I mean everything. I haven't paid it in 2 months." So I was angry.
Exhausted by the thought of having to dig out her family financially and disgusted by Chris's irresponsible behavior, Audrey knew she had to get out of the marriage.
It was constantly lies. I felt like you're 40-something years old and you still don't have your priorities straight. So I decided that I was done for good. The first thing out of my mouth was, "I want a divorce." And he was not happy with that, but my mind was made up.
Even though Audrey was determined to move on with her life, keeping the peace for the kids was important. And Audrey was pleasantly surprised when Chris seemed to be handling things like an adult.
I expressed to him that I would be moving out December 1st of that year. We worked opposite shifts, so I didn't really have to see him a lot. So things were civil.
But what happened next made Audrey think twice. Just a few weeks later, Chris picked Audrey up from work, and right away, she knew something was very wrong.
He met me at the bar right next door from my job and came in, had a beer, had a shot, and he wasn't a heavy drinker either. On the car ride home, he began telling me how I was his wife and I still had wifely duties that I needed to fulfill. I thought he was joking.
But once they arrived home, Audrey quickly realized Chris was dead serious.
I went into the bedroom and, like, out of nowhere, I find myself up against the wall and then thrown on the bed. Before I know it, he's trying to unbutton my pants, puts his hand over my mouth and says, "Shut the F up." I was just freaking out. And by the grace of God, I miraculously swept from under him and escaped and ran to my stepson's door and started banging on the door because I knew he would not do anything like that in front of his son. And that's exactly what happened. He stopped instantly.
Shaken, Audrey filed a domestic abuse report against Chris.
I was utterly shocked that he was capable of something so disgusting and violating.
Audrey wanted nothing more than to shut the book on her life with Chris Haney. But Chris wasn't about to let her go that easily.
Chris seemed extremely desperate to get her back at whatever cost.
My neighbor runs to me. She's just screaming.
He had become a monster.
By November of 2009, Audrey Mabry feared her estranged husband, Chris Haney, had become dangerous.
Audrey called me, and Chris tried to RAPE me, just like that. I was actually shocked. This is Chris. He loves her. He would never hurt her.
After speaking to the police, I left and went to a friend of mine's and stayed there for 4 days until I could get my own apartment.
Audrey was frightened, but she knew communication with Chris was inevitable.
I felt like I had to talk to him because he had birth certificates and social security cards, and I couldn't sign my lease without those documents.
When Audrey finally made contact a week later, Chris seemed like a different man. He was incredibly contrite and begged for forgiveness.
He continuously expressed that he was very sorry for whatever happened, but that he could not remember what happened. My excuse for him was he drank that night. So I thought maybe that was what caused it.
Chris told Audrey that if she didn't press charges, he would pay child support, and he would help her with the monthly bills.
Chris made it very clear to me that if he was to face these charges, that he was absolutely going to lose his job.
Audrey struggled with the decision, but ultimately agreed to Chris's terms and dropped the charges.
I wanted to believe the good in him. I wanted to believe that what he did was fueled by the alcohol.
As the two amicably began coordinating their schedules to take care of the children, Audrey couldn't help but feel she'd made the right choice.
We began taking care of the children as a team, where if we didn't want to wake up the kids in the middle of the night when I came home from work, then I would sleep at his house. And this continued for a couple of weeks.
Audrey felt relieved that the worst seemed to be behind her. She could never have known that her nightmare was just beginning. On November 17th, 2009, Audrey stopped by Chris's house after a jog. She simply wanted to wash up before work. But when Audrey opened the front door, Chris was waiting, and the sight was terrifying.
There he was, with a butcher knife in his hand, and charges at me. I remember turning for the door to open it and him shutting the door with his hand as he's got me scooped up from behind. And the knife caught me on my finger. So I look down to the floor and I see blood dropping to the floor. And in my mind, I'm like, this is very real.
Audrey desperately tried to make sense of the situation, while Chris dragged her into the garage, where he had a blanket laid out on the floor.
And he puts the knife to my throat, and he's trying to rape me from behind. And I'm saying to him, what are you doing? I love you, saying anything to make him stop.
But Chris only responded with more violence, hitting Audrey over the head with a hammer several times.
I'm thinking, oh my God, I'm gonna die right now. He was enraged beyond anything I've ever seen in my life. The image of my children comes to my mind, of them growing up alone. And I start praying, God, just let me live, that's all I want.
Audrey knew she was in a fight for her life, especially when Chris suddenly doused her with gasoline.
He looks at me, very enraged, angry, empty, and he tosses the candle at me like he's just tossing me the remote. I instantly go up in flames, and I spin up like at the speed of light, run to the main garage door, and I open it just enough for me to run out. And once my feet hit the grass, I dropped like everyone learned in elementary school, stop, drop, and roll. My neighbor runs to me. She's hitting me with her son's jacket, helping to put me out. And she's just screaming, oh my God, Audrey, oh my God, oh my God.
As the house went up in flames, the neighbor called 911.
Emergency dispatch. My neighbor was on fire. Your neighbor was on fire? What part of her body was injured? Her arms, she's bleeding, her face and her arms. And on fire, and her husband is inside. The house is on fire?
Our best information at the time was that Audrey may not survive. Chris was located by some bystanders just outside of the house in the backyard. He had a laceration to his neck, his wrist, and he also has a puncture wound on his left side.
Audrey and Chris were both airlifted to the nearest hospital. Audrey was almost fatally burned and barely conscious. And as she struggled to live, detectives began trying to shed light on Chris's horrific attack.
He told everybody, now I am the monster that she made me out to be.
The message he sent me was, it's time for you to prove how much you love those kids.
On November 17, 2009, Audrey Mabry was in intensive care, desperately fighting for her life.
I couldn't believe he did that. I can't believe he did that to her, just because he couldn't have her.
When I first arrived at the scene, I didn't know what had happened. The neighbor told us that Chris had set Audrey on fire. I did find out he was one of the persons that was transported to the hospital. So we knew where he was.
Investigators immediately went to question Chris at the hospital, but he refused to talk. Meanwhile, detectives discovered Chris owned a van that was not parked at the house.
We located his van about a half a mile away out of view and parked at a community building. That would lead me to believe that this was somewhat premeditated.
They also found several incriminating text messages Chris sent to friends and family just before the attack.
He said, now I am the monster that she made me out to be.
The text message he sent me was, it's time for you to prove how much you love those kids. I thought he was going to kill himself.
By the next day, investigators had enough evidence to place Chris under arrest for attempted murder.
The fact that Christopher had parked his personal vehicle about a half a mile from the incident scene. He had laid a blanket on the floor and used a candle from the bathroom. Those three items alone would indicate to me that this was a hastily devised plan.
It was 6 weeks before Audrey awoke from her medically induced coma. She was shocked to see she had been burned over 80% of her body.
When I looked at myself, I was absolutely devastated and then somehow determined that he was not going to rob me of what he wanted to rob me of. And that became my mission.
In the 3 months that followed, Audrey pushed through excruciating pain to relearn everyday tasks like walking. She also underwent 7 different trauma surgeries and skin grafts. Her main goal was to get back to her children and her life.
There were a lot of dark moments. It took me almost a year to get to a point where I saw a beautiful girl again, but not because she was all made up, but because she was repaired and renewed internally.
On January 24th, 2012, Chris Haney went to trial. He pleaded not guilty.
I was the first witness to go up. He looked me dead in my eye. It felt very surreal. I kept feeling my chest clench, and at one point I felt like I was going to vomit.
Prosecutors contended that Chris set out to kill Audrey and then himself because he was distraught over losing her. And the jury agreed. Chris was convicted of attempted murder, aggravated battery, and arson. On March 2nd, 2012, Chris Haney was sentenced to life in prison plus 2 30-year terms, just 2 days after his divorce from Audrey was finalized.
When I look back, him being so manipulative and so controlling of my lifelong decisions, that's absolutely a sign of someone who is capable of domestic violence. I believe Chris did what he did because he was a man that felt that he had lost everything. Therefore, he was capable of anything.
Audrey has since moved on with her life, but she still battles the after effects of Chris's attack.
The heat and the sun is an extreme struggle for me. My range of motion is not the same. Being burned is something that is a very long recovery.
Even with her struggles, Audrey has gone back to school. She has also been in a healthy, happy relationship for more than a year.
Despite the horrible things she went through that day, Audrey is definitely more beautiful now than she's ever been. She has a new purpose on life.
My purpose is to give people hope, to show people that no matter what happens to you in life, you must persevere, and you never know your true strength until you're tested.
The Pacific Ocean in the late autumn of 1939 was a vast, isolating expanse, a deep blue barrier that kept the islands of American Samoa largely insulated from the brewing storms of global conflict that were beginning to cast shadows over the rest of the world. In this remote archipelago, time seemed to move at a different pace, dictated not by the frantic ticking of Western clocks but by the ancient rhythms of the tides, the changing of the seasons, and the deeply entrenched cultural traditions that had guided the indigenous population for centuries. At the heart of this existence was the W'Amati system, an intricate, profound social structure based on extended families, clan loyalties, and the veneration of local chiefs. Under this system, the concept of the individual was intricately woven into the fabric of the community. Every action, every dispute, and every triumph was shared. The villages were incredibly tight-knit, operating on mutual respect and ancestral protocols designed specifically to maintain harmony and resolve conflicts long before they could escalate into irreversible tragedies. To live in American Samoa during this era was to live in a place where anonymity was impossible, where your neighbors knew your lineage, your temperament, and your history, making the sudden eruption of brutal, lethal violence not just a crime against a person, but a profound, traumatic tear in the very soul of the island. Yet, overlaid upon this ancient, communal way of life was a rigid, unforgiving architecture of foreign authority. American Samoa was not governed by a civilian democracy. It was under the direct, absolute administration of the United States Navy. The island of Tutuila, with its spectacular natural harbor, was a strategic military asset, and the society that populated it was subjected to naval discipline. The naval presence was an imposing reality, a stark contrast of crisp white uniforms and strict military protocols against the lush, tropical backdrop of the South Pacific. The administration operated with unilateral authority. The naval governor wielded extraordinary power, and the High Court, which handled all serious legal matters, functioned under this absolute naval oversight. There were no convoluted civilian appeals processes, no sensationalized media circuses, and no leniency for acts that threatened the peace and order of the territory. The military governed with a heavy, swift hand, viewing any disruption to the social order as a direct challenge to their mandate. This duality of existence, the deeply spiritual and connected Samoan culture forced to coexist under the uncompromising, sterile gavel of naval law, created a unique environment where justice was not just blind, but absolute and terrifyingly efficient. It is within this fragile intersection of ancient island tradition and strict military governance that one of the darkest and most haunting chapters in the history of American Samoa unfolded. It was a tragedy that began with personal grievance and ended with the ultimate, irreversible sanction of the state, marking the very last time the shadow of the gallows would fall upon the territory. This is the story of Amoa Tuito Elau, a native man whose name would become eternally tethered to the darkest extremes of human emotion, and Sela, a man whose life was violently extinguished in a manner so savage that it sent shockwaves through the normally peaceful villages. Sela was known to the community, recorded in the sparse historical documentation of the time, either as a foreigner or a man possessing roots from another island who had come to Tutuila to work and build a life. He was a man navigating the complex social dynamics of a tight-knit community, someone trying to secure his place in a world where lineage and local ties were paramount. The conflict that arose between Amoa and Sela was not born of international espionage, nor was it the result of a grand, organized criminal conspiracy. Instead, it was the tragic result of intensely personal, rapidly escalating disputes. It was the kind of human friction that, in any other circumstance, might have been diffused by the intervention of village elders or the slow, deliberate mediations dictated by the W'Amati. But the animosity between these two men bypassed the safety nets of tradition. The tension accumulated over a very short period, a rapid boiling over of pride, anger, and perceived slights. The speed at which this personal conflict deteriorated left no room for intervention, mutating quickly from bitter words into an explosive, uncontrollable rage. When the breaking point finally arrived, it did so with a level of brutality that defied the peaceful nature of the island. The instrument of this destruction was a heavy, broad-bladed machete, a common tool ubiquitous across the island. In the hands of the Samoan people, the machete was an instrument of life and sustenance. It was used to clear dense jungle paths, to harvest crops, to open coconuts, and to maintain the land that provided for the families. It was an extension of the worker, a symbol of agrarian survival. But in the hands of a Moa Tweedo Elau, consumed by a blinding, personal fury, this tool of cultivation was perverted into a weapon of horrific devastation. The attack on Sela was uncompromising and savage, a flurry of violence that ended a life and shattered the peace of the village of Fagatogo. The sheer ferocity of the murder left the small island community paralyzed with disbelief. It was an act of bloodshed so extreme that it immediately demanded the full, unyielding attention of the United States Navy's law enforcement apparatus. The response from the naval authorities was instantaneous and overwhelming. There was to be no protracted manhunt, no lingering mystery haunting the lush hills of Tutuila. Imoa was apprehended by naval security forces almost immediately after the brutal deed was done. The mechanism of military justice began to turn with a cold, mechanical efficiency. The investigation was straightforward, relying on the indisputable physical evidence of the crime scene and the undeniable reality of Imoa's actions. The High Court convened with a singular purpose, moving through the judicial process with a speed that highlighted the administration's determination to restore order and deliver a definitive message. The evidence of the savage machete attack was presented, laying bare the sheer brutality of the act. The nature of the murder, coupled with the clear identity of the perpetrator, left no room for reasonable doubt or legal maneuvering. The naval governor, overseeing the proceedings, recognized the profound impact the murder had on the local population. The sheer barbarity of the crime was viewed not merely as a loss of life, but as a dangerous precedent that could destabilize the territory if not met with the most severe response imaginable. Consequently, the High Court handed down the ultimate punishment. The governor approved the sentence of death by hanging, framing it explicitly as a stark, undeniable deterrent. The military administration wanted to ensure that the entire population understood the absolute boundaries of the law and the horrific consequences of crossing them. Justice in this era was not meant to rehabilitate, it was meant to punish, to display the absolute power of the governing authority, and to strike fear into the hearts of any who might contemplate a similar act of violence. The stage for this grim theater of deterrence was set in Fagatogo, the bustling administrative heart and the most active seaport of the island. Specifically, the execution was ordered to take place at the Customs House. This location was chosen with deliberate, chilling intent. The Customs House was the nexus of commerce, the point of entry and exit, and a symbol of governmental control. By erecting the gallows at this highly visible, heavily trafficked center, the naval authorities guaranteed that the execution would not be a quiet, hidden affair conducted behind prison walls. It was designed to be a public spectacle of ultimate authority, a grim reminder looming over the daily lives of the islanders. The wooden structure of the gallows stood in stark, terrifying contrast to the surrounding tropical beauty and the vibrant life of the port, casting a long, sobering shadow over the community. The date was set for the morning of November 24, 1939. As the day approached, a heavy, oppressive atmosphere settled over Fagatogo and the surrounding villages. The impending execution was an unnatural disruption to the rhythm of island life. While the community was deeply traumatized by the brutal murder of Sela, the prospect of witnessing the state-sanctioned taking of another life brought its own profound psychological burden. The event marked a permanent scar on the history of the island, an intersection where personal rage met the cold, calculated machinery of military justice. Yet, what elevates the story of Imoa Tweedo Elau from a simple, tragic historical footnote of military justice into an enduring, powerful piece of Samoan cultural memory is not the brutality of the murder, nor the strictness of the naval court, but the astonishing, deeply emotional moments that unfolded immediately before the execution. As Imoa was escorted up the wooden steps of the gallows at the Customs House, facing the terrifying reality of the hangman's noose and the eyes of his community, he did not exhibit the behavior of a man consumed by panic. He did not fight his captors, Nor did he scream out proclamations of innocence or hurl curses at the military authority that had condemned him. Instead, he possessed an unnatural, transcendent calm. Standing on the platform, looking out over the harbor, the island, and the faces of the people, Imoa began to sing. He sang a song he had composed himself while awaiting his fate. His voice carried across the quiet, tense air of the harbor, delivering a message that was completely devoid of self-pity. The lyrics translated to an urgent plea for Samoa to listen, acknowledging that a terrible mistake had occurred. It was not a plea for his life, but a profound, public confession and an apology. Imoa used his final breaths to express a deep, agonizing remorse to the entire population of Samoa for having stained their peaceful land with violence. He acknowledged the pain he had caused, the disruption to the sacred harmony of the island, and the failure of his own spirit to control his rage. Furthermore, the song served as a desperate, powerful warning to the younger generation and to all who would come after him. He implored them to recognize the devastating consequences of unbridled anger, to respect the sanctity of life, to adhere strictly to the laws that govern them, and, most importantly, to hold fast to the traditional moral values that define their culture. He turned his own impending death into a solemn lesson, hoping that the tragedy of his actions and his subsequent punishment would prevent future bloodshed. The trapdoor fell, and the era of capital punishment in American Samoa was sealed, but the echoes of Imoa's final performance refused to fade. His song was absorbed by the crowd, deeply moving those who witnessed the execution. It was remembered, memorized, and passed down through the oral traditions of the island. Over the decades, it transitioned from a grim historical artifact into a widely recognized, deeply respected folk song. Generations of Samoan artists and musicians would go on to record and perform it, ensuring that the melody and its heavy moral weight survived long after the U.S. Navy relinquished its direct control to the Department of the Interior in 1951. The Customs House, the site of this ultimate punishment, still stands today as a national historic landmark, a silent witness to a turbulent era of transition. But it is the song, soaring above the grim reality of the gallows, that truly immortalized the case, serving as a permanent, haunting reminder of the devastating cost of violence and the enduring power of remorse. To truly understand the tragedy that unfolded in the village of Fagatogo, one must first immerse themselves in the intricate, insular world of Tutuila in the late 1930s. The island was a place of breathtaking physical beauty, characterized by emerald volcanic peaks that plunged dramatically into the deep, crystalline waters of the Pacific. At the center of this rugged landscape was Pago Pago Harbor, a natural sanctuary that had drawn the strategic gaze of the United States Navy decades prior. By 1939, the area surrounding the harbor, particularly the village of Fagatogo, had transformed into a unique crucible where ancient Polynesian traditions were forced into daily, unavoidable contact with the rigid structures of Western military authority. The air was consistently heavy with tropical humidity, carrying the scent of salt, blooming hibiscus, and the faint, ever-present exhaust of naval vessels anchoring in the bay. It was a sensory environment that felt both deeply isolated from the anxieties of the broader world and intensely concentrated, a microcosm where every social interaction was magnified by the sheer geographical limitations of the island. In this confined paradise, anonymity was an entirely foreign concept. The physical boundaries of the island mirrored the social boundaries of its people, creating a pressure cooker of proximity where everyone was intimately aware of their neighbors, their lineages, and their daily business. At the very foundation of this society was the Fa Amatai, an ancient and incredibly complex socio-political system that governed every aspect of indigenous Samoan life. This was not merely a set of outdated customs, but a living, breathing framework of social organization that prioritized the collective over the individual in every conceivable way. Under the Fa Amatai, society was organized around extended family groups, each led by a Matai, a chief who held the title and the responsibility for the welfare, land, and behavior of their extended kin. Loyalty to the family was absolute, forming an invisible but unbreakable web of obligations, respect, and mutual support that spanned the entire island. When disputes arose, they were rarely viewed as isolated incidents between two solitary individuals. Instead, they were community matters, requiring the careful, deliberate mediation of the Matai to restore harmony and prevent any disruption to the collective peace. This system had successfully maintained order and cultural continuity for centuries, creating a deeply rooted sense of belonging and identity among the native population. To be a native Samoan was to be an integral thread in a vast, complex tapestry of familial ties and historical alliances. It provided absolute security, but it also demanded total adherence to strict protocols of respect and hierarchy. Into this dense, heavily woven social fabric stepped a man named Sela. The historical records from the naval administration regarding Sela are frustratingly sparse, painting a picture of a man who existed on the absolute periphery of the dominant social structures. The data identifies him simply as a foreigner, or perhaps a man possessing roots from a neighboring island, who had traveled to Tutuila for the sole purpose of finding work. In 1939, the presence of the United States Navy meant that Fagatogo was the economic engine of the territory. The military base, the bustling port, and the administrative centers required labor, drawing individuals from outside the immediate, tight-knit Samoan circles who were eager to earn a living in the shadow of the American establishment. Sela was one of these men, an outsider navigating a world that was fundamentally not his own. His existence on the island was defined by his labor and his status as an alien within a community that valued bloodlines and chiefly titles above all else. Living as a migrant worker in American Samoa during this era was an exercise in profound social isolation. Without an extended family structure to support him, without a Matai to advocate for his interests, and without the deep ancestral ties to the land that define the native experience, Sela would have had to rely entirely on his own wits, resilience, and work ethic. He walked daily through a village where the spoken language, the subtle gestures of respect, and the unwritten rules of social engagement were deeply ingrained in the locals, but required constant, careful deciphering for an outsider. Every interaction he had, whether at the docks, in the small trading stores, or in the spaces between the naval buildings and the traditional dwellings, carried the inherent friction of his foreignness. He was a man trying to build a foundation on soil where he had no roots, working hard in a tropical heat that demanded physical endurance, all while remaining highly visible as an anomaly in a remarkably homogeneous society. The psychological toll of this existence cannot be understated. It required a constant, vigilant balancing act, an ongoing effort to participate in the economic life of the island while avoiding the complex cultural tripwires that could easily spark misunderstandings or resentment among the local population. On the opposite side of this impending tragedy was Moa Tuito Elau, a native Samoan man whose life was the exact antithesis of Sela's isolated existence. Imoa was a product of the Fa Amatai, deeply embedded in the village life of Fagatogo. He was surrounded by his extended family, protected by the ancestral structures of his community, and intimately familiar with the rhythms and expectations of his culture. For Imoa, the island was not a workplace, but a sacred inheritance, a place where his identity was validated by the collective memory of his people. His worldview was shaped by the traditional values of respect, pride, and the defense of personal and familial honor. When a native man like Imoa interacted with an outsider like Sela, the dynamic was inherently unbalanced. Imoa operated from a position of profound cultural security and unspoken authority derived simply from his belonging, while Sela operated from a position of vulnerability, constantly aware of his status as a guest, or perhaps an intruder, in a closed society. The precise nature of the initial spark that ignited the fatal animosity between Imoa and Sela remains buried in the forgotten archives of the naval administration, but the trajectory of their conflict is agonizingly clear. What began as a mundane disagreement mutated with terrifying speed into a deeply personal, consuming hatred. In a sprawling, anonymous city, two men experiencing such intense friction could simply walk away, avoiding each other and allowing time and distance to dilute their anger. But in the village of Fagatogo, distance was an absolute impossibility. The geography of the island forced them into continuous, suffocating proximity. They likely crossed paths daily, their unspoken animosity festering in the humid air, each encounter serving to escalate the tension. A misunderstood glance, a harsh word spoken in haste, a perceived slight regarding work or social standing, all of these minor infractions were magnified by the pressure cooker of their environment and the stark differences in their social standing. The fact that this dispute escalated so rapidly is a crucial element of the tragedy. It bypassed the traditional safety mechanisms that the Samoan culture had spent centuries perfecting. Normally, a dispute between two men would be recognized by the community long before it reached a boiling point. The community elders would intervene, calling the parties together, demanding apologies, and enforcing a peaceful resolution in the name of the collective good. The Fa Amatai was specifically designed to cool the fires of personal pride before they could threaten the village. However, because Sela was an outsider, he existed outside this protective framework. There was no chief to speak for him, no family to demand a formal mediation on his behalf. The conflict between him and Emoa fell into a dangerous, unmonitored void between the ancient traditions of the indigenous people and the cold, indifferent legal structures of the naval authorities. The community, perhaps viewing the dispute as an isolated issue involving a foreigner, or perhaps simply unaware of the depth of the rage building within Emoa, failed to intervene. This isolation allowed the anger to calcify into something far more dangerous. For Emoa, whatever perceived insult or injury Sela had inflicted became an intolerable affront to his pride and his standing within his own land. The psychological pressure of nursing such intense grievance in a small, interconnected village must have been overwhelming. The constant sight of the man who had wronged him, existing and working in his territory, acted as a daily accelerant to his fury. The conflict shed any pretense of a simple disagreement and became a matter of visceral, destructive honor. The speed of this emotional descent was staggering, transforming a native man known to his community into an individual capable of inflicting horrific, unspeakable violence, entirely losing sight of the peaceful tenets that had governed his people for generations. Conversely, Sela must have felt the tightening of this dangerous web with a growing sense of dread. Navigating a personal conflict with a local in a tight-knit, traditional society is incredibly perilous for an isolated worker. He likely felt the silent judgments of the community, the shifting dynamics of his daily interactions, and the looming, unpredictable threat of Emoa's escalating anger. Whether he actively attempted to defuse the situation, silently sought help from the detached naval authorities, or simply tried to keep his head down and focus entirely on his physical labor, his efforts were ultimately, tragically futile. He was trapped on a small island, surrounded by an endless ocean, locked in an escalating feud with a man who felt a deep, ancestral ownership over the very ground they stood upon. The psychological burden of knowing that a conflict is spiraling out of control, coupled with the realization that there is no safe harbor to retreat to, must have been a terrifying reality for the migrant worker. The tension eventually reached a critical mass, a breaking point where words, social posturing, and silent resentment were no longer sufficient to contain the explosive rage. The atmosphere in Fagatogo grew increasingly heavy, not just with the tropical humidity, but with the unseen, inevitable momentum of violence. The stage was tragically set for a horrific collision, a brutal and unforgiving intersection of a native son utterly consumed by personal grievance and a solitary outsider who had nowhere to run and absolutely no one to protect him from the devastating storm that was about to break over the otherwise peaceful, enduring village. It was a failure of two colliding worlds, leaving a vulnerable man entirely exposed to a fatal, irreversible act of destruction. The late months of 1939 in the village of Fagatogo were characterized by a heavy, unrelenting heat that defined the South Pacific before the onset of the seasonal rains. The air was thick, almost viscous, pressing down on the tin roofs of the naval administrative buildings and the woven thatch of the traditional Samoan dwellings with an equal, suffocating weight. This was an environment where the physical climate perfectly mirrored the suffocating psychological tension that had taken root between the native man Emoa Tuito Elau and the isolated migrant worker known to the village only as Sela. On the day the violence finally erupted, the village was engaged in its typical, rhythmic routines, completely oblivious to the shadow of death that was about to fall over the harbor. The sounds of the bustling port provided a constant, mechanical backdrop to the organic noises of island life. Gray naval vessels groaned heavily against the wooden docks. Cargo was being methodically offloaded by sweating local laborers, and the faint, high-pitched calls of seabirds drifted down from the towering emerald peaks that tightly encircled the bay. It was a setting of profound, deceptive normalcy, a picturesque tropical morning that betrayed no hint of the approaching tragedy. For the vast majority of the inhabitants of Fagatogo, this day was indistinguishable from any other, a simple continuation of the steady, uninterrupted flow of communal time that had governed the island for countless generations. The local people went about their daily tasks, walking the familiar dirt paths, exchanging customary greetings, entirely unaware that the delicate, deeply respected fabric of their peaceful community was about to be violently torn apart. But for Amoa and Sela, the day carried the invisible, highly volatile electric charge of a rapidly approaching storm. The bitter animosity that had been festering in the shadows, nurtured by geographic proximity and wounded pride, had finally consumed whatever remaining restraint existed within the native man. The village, with its narrow, interconnected paths and heavily shared public spaces, offered absolutely no sanctuary, no neutral ground where the escalating hostility could be safely diffused or avoided. The confined geography of Fagatogo forced the two men into a fatal convergence. Sela, going about his demanding, exhausting physical labor, was entirely exposed to the world around him. He was a man focused purely on daily survival, on navigating the steep complexities of his foreign environment, likely completely oblivious to the sheer, murderous depth of the rage that had finally overwhelmed his adversary. The tragic, underlying reality of Sela's existence was that his profound social isolation rendered him blind to the subtle, highly dangerous shifts in the local social undercurrents. He could not read the cultural warning signs that might have been glaringly obvious to an insider embedded within the village network. He was simply existing, working silently under the oppressive, beating sun, entirely defenseless against the hurricane of personal grievance that was about to violently strike him down. The instrument chosen for this catastrophic, irreversible release of tension was not a modern, manufactured weapon of war, nor was it a specialized tool designed specifically for the taking of human life. It was a large, incredibly heavy bush knife, a traditional machete, an object of absolute, mundane utility that was ubiquitous across every single village and agricultural plantation in American Samoa. To fully comprehend the sheer horror of the incident, one must intimately understand the nature of this specific tool within the context of daily island life. In the hands of a skilled, hard-working Samoan, the bush knife was literally an extension of the arm, a vital, indispensable instrument for both cultivation and basic survival. It possessed a broad, remarkably thick steel blade, weighted heavily toward the tip in order to provide maximum kinetic energy and devastating momentum with every single downward swing. It was kept meticulously sharp by its owner, fully capable of severing thick, resilient jungle vines, splitting the incredibly tough outer husks of fallen coconuts, and clearing dense, fibrous tropical undergrowth with an effortless, sweeping efficiency. The wooden handle was worn perfectly smooth by years of intensive labor, permanently shaped by the sweat, the friction, and the calluses of the men who relied heavily upon it to provide sustenance for their extended families. It was an enduring symbol of agricultural life, a testament to man's harmonious, albeit deeply arduous, relationship with the fertile volcanic earth of the island. But on this specific, fateful day, in the trembling, tightly gripped hands of Amoa Tweedo Alau, this vital instrument of life was subjected to a grotesque, terrifying inversion of its core purpose. The very physical characteristics that made the bush knife so incredibly essential for daily agriculture, its devastating, unbalanced weight, its razor-sharp cutting edge, and its capacity for deep, severing impact, instantly transformed it into a weapon of unimaginable, close-quarters savagery. When a tool explicitly designed to conquer the dense, unforgiving jungle foliage is suddenly turned against the fragile, unprotected architecture of the human body, the physical results are absolutely catastrophic. The choice of this specific weapon spoke volumes about the raw, visceral nature of Amoa's blinding rage. It was not a detached, cowardly, or clinical method of elimination executed from a safe distance. It was horrifyingly intimate, demanding immense, sustained physical exertion, forcing the attacker into horrific, blood-soaked proximity with his victim. It required the wielder to physically feel the devastating, sickening impact of every single blow, to directly witness the immediate, traumatic destruction of living flesh and splintering bone. The precise moment of the attack completely defied the peaceful, deeply ingrained inertia of the Samoan village. There was no formal declaration of combat, no civilized preamble or shouted warning preceding the slaughter. The abrupt transition from strained, heavy silence to absolute, bloody chaos was totally instantaneous. Amoa descended upon Sela with a shocking ferocity that completely shattered the heavy, humid air of the port town. The initial, terrifying strike was a pure manifestation of unadulterated, blinding hatred, delivered with the full, devastating muscular force of a man who had entirely abandoned his humanity and surrendered himself completely to his rage. The heavy steel blade of the bush knife tore violently through the peaceful illusion of Fagatogo, finding its unprotected mark with a sickening, definitive impact that echoed terribly against the nearby buildings. For Sela, the sudden attack was an incomprehensible, waking nightmare. The solitary migrant worker, whose only true offense was existing on the wrong side of a rapidly deteriorating, deeply personal conflict, suddenly found himself subjected to an overwhelming onslaught of unimaginable, unrelenting brutality. The physical reality of the assault was a chaotic, terrifying blur of aggressive motion and blinding agony. Sela possessed absolutely no adequate means of defense against the heavy, rapidly swinging steel blade. His bare hands, heavily calloused from honest labor, were entirely, tragically insufficient to ward off or deflect the devastating blows raining down upon his body. He was completely trapped in a localized whirlwind of extreme violence, a solitary, vulnerable man being systematically dismantled by an overwhelming, primal fury. The bush knife, wielded with the desperate, inexhaustible energy of absolute malice, inflicted horrific, life-ending trauma. Each heavy swing was a catastrophic physical event, deeply severing muscle tissue, violently fracturing bone, and instantly draining the vital life force from the isolated, terrified worker. The attack was not a single, unfortunate fatal blow resulting from a brief scuffle, but a heavily sustained, incredibly frenzied sequence of deliberate, targeted violence. Amoa was entirely consumed by the horrific physical act, his vision narrowed completely to the singular, terrible task of permanently obliterating the human source of his perceived grievance. The sheer, uncompromising brutality of the murder was a physical manifestation of a profound, catastrophic psychological collapse. In those few terrifying moments, Amoa had completely stripped away centuries of strict cultural conditioning, ignoring the deep-seated, sacred Samoan mandates for peace, respect, and communal harmony, regressing entirely to a state of raw, lethal barbarism. Sela's desperate, agonizing struggle for survival was heartbreakingly brief. The overwhelming, massive physical trauma inflicted by the heavy, razor-sharp blade rapidly incapacitated his bodily functions, violently collapsing his broken form onto the unforgiving dirt earth of the village he had merely sought to work and survive in. The sheer savagery and depth of the lacerations left absolutely no medical possibility of survival, no lingering hope for any kind of intervention, extinguishing his lonely human life with a terrifying, incredibly messy finality. When the furious, terrifying kinetic energy of the attack finally expended itself, an unnatural, deeply traumatic, and haunting stillness rapidly descended upon the immediate vicinity. The violent, bloody tempest suddenly subsided, leaving behind a horrific scene of unspeakable carnage that stood in stark, grotesque contrast to the vibrant, pristine tropical beauty of the surrounding island. The dry earth of Fagatogo, usually trodden peacefully by the bare feet of playing children and the steady, dignified pace of village elders, was suddenly, irreversibly stained a deep crimson with the lifeblood of a brutally murdered man. Sela lay completely broken, mutilated, and motionless, his incredibly difficult journey as a migrant worker terminating in a brutal, agonizing, and intensely lonely death thousands of miles away from his own ancestral home. He had instantly become a tragic, bleeding monument to the devastating, irreversible consequences of unchecked, entirely consuming human fury. Surrounding the horrifying, silent epicenter of the crime, the general atmosphere of the village morphed instantly from mundane, sleepy tranquility to absolute, paralyzing, wide-eyed shock. Those innocent bystanders who were unfortunate enough to witness the bloody conclusion of the attack or to stumble blindly upon its immediate, grisly aftermath were struck completely dumb by the sheer scale and savagery of the violence. The peaceful community, deeply unaccustomed to such visceral, deliberate bloodshed in their public spaces, found their collective, comfortable reality violently and permanently ruptured. The visual sight of the mutilated body and the heavy, blood-soaked bush knife created a deep sensory trauma that would permanently scar the collective, enduring memory of the island population. Imoa Tweedo Alau stood silently amidst the utter devastation he had just manually wrought, the heavy, dripping steel blade hanging completely limply from his exhausted hand. The blinding, all-consuming rage that had powerfully propelled him through the horrific, physically demanding act began to rapidly evaporate from his mind, instantly replaced by the crushing, inescapable, and suffocating weight of his irreversible actions. The massive surge of adrenaline that had fueled his murderous frenzy quickly receded, leaving him suddenly stranded in a new, terrifying, and profoundly isolated reality. He was no longer just a respected native son of Samoa. He had violently transformed himself into an unforgivable pariah, a man who had committed the absolute ultimate transgression against the sacred, protected peace of his ancestral community. The air around him, previously thick with the simple heat of the tropical day and the burning tension of his personal grievance, now felt utterly, terrifyingly devoid of oxygen, heavy with the sharp, metallic scent of spilled blood and the absolute, unwavering certainty of his own impending doom. He did not make any frantic attempt to drop the weapon and flee into the dense, forgiving foliage of the jungle that thickly blanketed the nearby volcanic slopes. He did not make any desperate attempt to conceal the horrific, overwhelming physical evidence of his brutal crime. The absolute, undeniable finality of what he had just done anchored his feet completely to the blood-stained spot. The profound, heartbreaking social isolation that had previously characterized Sela's difficult life in the village had now violently and poetically transferred itself entirely to his murderer. Despite standing in the very heart of Fagatogo, completely surrounded by his ancient ancestral land and his vast extended community network, the native man was now entirely, devastatingly, and permanently alone. He simply stood over the shattered, lifeless remains of his victim, breathing heavily in the sudden quiet, waiting passively for the heavy, uncompromising, and deeply punitive hand of the United States naval law enforcement to rapidly descend upon him and officially claim the terrible, ultimate debt he had just selfishly incurred against the peace of the island. The silence that followed the horrific act of violence in Fagatogo was not a peaceful stillness, but a heavy, suffocating shroud that signaled the immediate activation of the United States Navy's administrative machinery. In a society where the Fa Amati system traditionally mediated conflict through communal deliberation and the nuanced authority of the Matai, the arrival of naval security forces represented a jarring, mechanical shift in justice. There was no room for the slow, restorative processes of the village when the brutal, public murder of a man had occurred in the very center of the colonial administration's stronghold. The response was clinical, efficient, and utterly devoid of the customary Samoan protocols. Within minutes of the attack, the tranquil rhythm of the village was permanently broken by the arrival of naval personnel, their crisp, stark white uniforms and authoritative demeanor creating an immediate, jarring visual contrast against the lush, tropical background. They were not there to understand the complex, social-cultural web that had led to the dispute, nor were they interested in the historical grievances between the two men. Their mandate was defined by the singular necessity of maintaining order under the ironclad rule of the Navy. Imoa Tuido Elau, who had remained standing over the body of his victim in a state of stunned, hollow realization, offered no resistance. He was apprehended immediately, his hands bound by cold, unforgiving steel, effectively transitioning from a member of the community to a prisoner of the naval state. The scene of the crime was secured with a sterile, military precision as investigators began the grim, routine task of gathering evidence. The blood-stained bush knife, which had been the instrument of such profound devastation, was meticulously collected as the central piece of physical evidence. There were no mysterious elements, no hidden accomplices, and no complex motives to untangle. The reality of the crime was laid bare in its most grotesque and simple form. The investigators documented the position of the victim, the nature of the lethal wounds, and the immediate proximity of the weapon to the perpetrator. Every detail was recorded in formal, detached reports that would serve as the foundation for a legal process that was destined to be swift and unyielding. The focus of this investigation was not to discover the truth, but to confirm the overwhelming factual basis for a predetermined conclusion. The investigative process was conducted with an urgency that reflected the Navy's deep concern over the stability of the territory. The murder had sent shockwaves through the local community, creating an atmosphere of fear and uncertainty that the administration was desperate to suppress. They viewed the violence not merely as a criminal tragedy, but as a direct, destabilizing challenge to the naval authority that had been imposed upon the island. Consequently, the interrogation of Imoa was not a dialogue, but a formal processing of a man whose guilt was already established by the absolute clarity of the evidence. He was subjected to questioning within the rigid, sterile environments of the naval offices, a world that felt fundamentally alien to the spirit of the Samoan people. In these rooms, the air-conditioned, artificial environment contrasted sharply with the warm, humid air of the village. The investigators, speaking in a language and operating under a legal framework that prioritized objective, cold facts over the subjective, social truths of the islanders, pushed for a narrative that was entirely focused on the mechanics of the crime. Imoa, stripped of his protective, communal identity, was forced to confront the bureaucratic reality of his future. The evidence against him was insurmountable. The sheer number and depth of the wounds inflicted upon Sela left no room for legal defense regarding intent or degree of culpability. His own presence at the scene, the recovery of the weapon, and the overwhelming testimony of the shocked witnesses created an airtight, undeniable case that would be presented to the High Court of American Samoa. As the legal proceedings began to take shape, the village of Fagatogo entered a state of profound, collective mourning and deep, existential anxiety. The shock of the murder had transformed into a grim, sobering realization of the consequences that were rapidly approaching. The families, the Matai, and the ordinary people who moved through the village daily were forced to watch as the naval authorities moved with mechanical, terrifying efficiency to finalize the case. There were no hidden corners or secret trials. The process was as public and as final as the crime itself had been. The High Court, operating under the absolute authority of the naval governor, scheduled the hearings with a deliberate speed that highlighted their intention to set a definitive, unchangeable precedent. During these days, the atmosphere in Fagatogo became one of hushed, expectant misery. The usual, vibrant sounds of daily life were suppressed, replaced by a somber quiet that hung over the entire harbor. People spoke in hushed tones about the impending fate of Imoa, a man they had once known as a friend, a neighbor, and a contributor to their community, who was now irrevocably defined by his single, catastrophic act of rage. The judicial process was a mirror of the tragedy itself. It was cold, decisive, and entirely unforgiving. Throughout the investigation, there was a complete absence of any attempt to mitigate the harsh, incoming judgment of the military authorities. The defense, if it existed at all in any meaningful sense, was dwarfed by the sheer, overwhelming evidence of the brutality of the act. The naval governor, a man tasked with the absolute, undisputed security of the territory, acted with a singular, unyielding vision of justice. He perceived the crime as a direct affront to the peace of the island and the authority of the United States. The potential for the community to spiral into chaos, or for similar acts of violence to proliferate, was a fear that dominated the administrative mindset. Thus, the decision to pursue the most severe, final penalty was not a matter of extended, philosophical debate. It was an act of administrative policy designed to ensure the absolute, total deterrence of any future violence. The investigators and legal staff moved with a sense of purpose that left absolutely no room for doubt or ambiguity. The trial itself, when it convened, was a stark exhibition of the power imbalance between the indigenous people and their foreign administrators. The proceedings were conducted in a manner that felt increasingly distant from the local, cultural understanding of justice and reconciliation. The high courtroom was a space of rigid, linear protocols, where the judge's hammer falling was a sound of ultimate, state-sanctioned finality. Imoa, during this time, appeared to undergo a profound, internal transformation. The man who had been consumed by the blinding, unmanageable rage of his crime was now a man confronting the absolute, final limitations of his human existence. The process of being investigated, the cold, impersonal nature of the questioning, and the realization that he was being processed by a system that did not recognize his humanity or his cultural background, forced him into a state of quiet, meditative introspection. He began to look beyond the immediate, physical world, turning his focus toward his own soul and his duty to the community he had so violently betrayed. It was during this period of confinement, waiting for the final, catastrophic verdict of the court, that the song he would later sing began to take its form. It was not a song of defiance, nor was it a song of grievance against the injustice of the system that was destroying him. It was a song of confession, of deep, sorrowful regret, and of a desperate, final plea for the preservation of the values that he had discarded in his moment of madness. His thoughts were consumed by the image of his home, the beauty of the village, and the deep, abiding shame of having brought such darkness into the heart of his people. He understood that his life was forfeited, and that the only remaining purpose he possessed was to use his death as a vessel for a final, crucial lesson to the future generations of Samoa. The investigation, therefore, served as the crucible in which the tragedy was refined from a simple, brutal murder into a moment of cultural, long-lasting significance. The Navy, in its quest for order, had inadvertently provided the stage for an act of profound, personal remorse that would resonate for decades. While they were busy documenting the physical evidence of the death of Sela, they were simultaneously, and perhaps entirely unwittingly, documenting the spiritual reclamation of Imoa. The case was finalized not with the cold, bureaucratic closure the administration had sought, but with the creation of an enduring, oral, and musical legacy that turned a cold, military execution into a story that was deeply embedded in the heart of the Samoan people. The tragedy of the murder had effectively split the history of the island into two distinct, irreconcilable parts, and the investigation, with its clinical, cold, and unrelenting focus on the crime, was the bridge between the two. The naval authorities believed they were merely exercising a standard, legal necessity. They did not realize that they were active participants in the creation of a profound, cultural myth. The finality of the investigation and the subsequent, inevitable sentencing phase left no alternative paths for the people of Samoa. They could only watch as the machinery of the law reached its final, logical conclusion, a reality that Imoa himself had already, internally, moved far beyond. The proceedings of the High Court of American Samoa, held under the direct, unwavering gaze of the United States Naval Administration, were a stark departure from the traditional, communal resolution processes that had defined life in Fagatogo for generations. The trial of Imoa Tuido Elau was not a search for truth, for the truth of the physical act had been laid bare in the moments following the murder. Instead, the courtroom became an arena where the absolute, uncompromising authority of the governing power was established and reinforced. The chamber, filled with the sterile, imposing presence of naval officers and the hushed, anxious members of the public, felt like a boundary line between two incompatible worlds. On one side stood the indigenous people, accustomed to a form of justice that emphasized the restoration of balance and the recognition of family responsibility, and on the other stood the U.S. Navy, representing a legal system rooted in the concepts of individual accountability, deterrence, and the state's absolute power to punish. For the islanders, the trial was a source of profound, collective shame. The shame was not directed at the court, but at the realization that one of their own had committed an act of such utter, unforgivable savagery that the entire community was now forced to submit to the cold, mechanical judgment of a foreign entity. The court session itself was conducted with a swift, mechanical efficiency that left no space for the slow, deliberative nature of traditional dispute resolution. The prosecutor, a naval legal officer, presented the evidence with the clinical detachment of a man detailing the components of a failed machine. The murder of Sella was described in granular, horrific detail, focusing entirely on the physical trauma inflicted by the bush knife. Every strike was counted, every wound was documented, and every drop of evidence was highlighted to emphasize the premeditated, or at the very least, the wildly unrestrained nature of the violence. There was no attempt to explain the background of the conflict, no effort to understand the pressures that had built up between the two men, and certainly no consideration given to the cultural context that might have otherwise mediated the dispute. To the court, the circumstances were irrelevant. The only thing that mattered was the act itself and the necessity of demonstrating the absolute consequences of such an act. Imoa sat throughout the proceedings in a state of quiet, almost transcendent detachment. He did not speak in his own defense, nor did he look for sympathy from the judges or the onlookers. He seemed to have accepted his fate long before the gavel struck the desk, his demeanor suggesting a man who had already settled his accounts with his own conscience. The testimony from the witnesses was minimal, as the visual evidence of the crime was so incontrovertible that extended questioning was deemed unnecessary. The community members who were called to the stand spoke with heads bowed, their voices barely audible, conveying a sense of communal mourning rather than a desire to secure a conviction. They were not testifying to condemn Imoa. They were witnessing the final, inevitable collapse of a tragedy they had been unable to prevent. The defense, such as it was entirely symbolic. There were no complex legal arguments regarding insanity, mitigating circumstances, or the lack of premeditation. The reality of the bloody, mutilated body of Sella was an obstacle that no defense strategy could overcome in a court that viewed itself as the final, absolute arbiter of order. The naval governor, who exerted ultimate influence over the proceedings, had made it abundantly clear that the outcome of this case would serve as a powerful deterrent. The intention was to send a message so clear and so terrifying that it would eradicate the possibility of similar violence, cementing the administration's control over the territory by demonstrating the ultimate power they held over the lives of their subjects. When the verdict of guilty was finally delivered, it was received not with shock, but with a profound, heavy silence. The outcome had been an inevitability from the moment Imoa was apprehended at the scene. The gravity of the crime had essentially removed any other possibility within the framework of the naval military law. The sentence of death by hanging, to be carried out at the customs house, was the only conclusion that could satisfy the administrative requirement for a deterrent that would resonate across the island. The judge, in delivering the sentence, spoke of the necessity of maintaining the peace and the solemn duty of the court to protect the innocent from such vicious, uncontrolled displays of rage. The language used was that of a foreign power exercising authority over a domain that was not its own, a cold and impersonal articulation of a final, irrevocable decision. Imoa listened to the pronouncement with the same quiet, steady composure that he had maintained throughout the trial. For him, the verdict was not a surprise. It was the final step in a process of atonement that he had begun in the solitude of his holding cell. The sentence was the mechanism by which he would be permitted to pay his debt to his people and to the memory of the man he had murdered. The days between the sentencing and the execution were a period of intense, shared mourning throughout the village of Fagatogo. The impending reality of the gallows became the central, overwhelming focus of the community. In the traditional, pre-colonial sense, justice would have involved a process of restitution, with the family of the perpetrator making amends to the family of the victim to restore the harmony of the island. The imposition of the death penalty was a complete, final destruction of this possibility, replacing the potential for reconciliation with a singular act of state-sanctioned vengeance. The people of the island felt this shift acutely. They understood that the execution would not fix what had been broken, but would simply ensure that the darkness would remain in their midst. They held vigils and prayer meetings, not to save Amoah, for they knew he was beyond saving, but to navigate the collective, traumatic experience of the state's impending, brutal intervention. The customs house, once a symbol of trade and economic development, began to be viewed with a different, darker significance. It was the site where the absolute, final power of the military would be displayed, a place where the life of one of their own would be taken in the name of a law that many of them barely understood. As the morning of November 24, 1939, approached, the atmosphere in Fagatogo was one of almost physical pressure. The morning dawned with the same lush, tropical beauty as any other day, but the light seemed to carry a different, more somber weight. The execution was scheduled for the early hours, a time meant to minimize the public disruption while still ensuring that the event had the desired, sobering effect. The crowd that gathered was not one of onlookers seeking sensation, but a mass of people bound by a shared, traumatic history and a common need to witness the end of the tragedy. They watched in complete, total silence as the naval guards, stiff and unyielding in their uniforms, escorted Amoah toward the gallows. Every footstep echoed in the quiet air, a metronome for the final moments of his life. The structure of the gallows stood against the bright, blue sky like an unnatural, jarring protrusion, a stark reminder of the foreign law that now defined the fate of the island's inhabitants. Amoah's final appearance on the platform was a moment that would define the collective memory of this event. He did not look like a man facing his executioner, but like a man approaching a pulpit. His demeanor, which had been quiet and meditative throughout his incarceration, reached a point of absolute, serene clarity as he stepped onto the wooden planks. He looked out over the harbor, the village, and the faces of his people, not with fear, but with a deep, consuming sense of purpose. When he began to sing, the sound was not that of a cry for help or a howl of pain, but a resonant, haunting melody that cut through the silence of the harbor. The song was the culmination of his transformation, the final, external manifestation of his internal, painful process of atonement. He was speaking directly to the heart of Samoa, his voice carrying the weight of his regret and his desperate, final hope for his people. The naval officers, standing stiffly on the periphery, were visibly unsettled by this display as it defied the clinical, cold, and dehumanizing process they had attempted to impose. They had intended to create a spectacle of terror, but Amoah had converted it into a moment of profound, human connection. His song, Fafafaga Samoa, began to flow through the air, and for those who heard it, the presence of the gallows, the guards, and the naval authorities seemed to fade, replaced by the immediate, overwhelming power of his final, penitent words. The execution was the final, mechanical act of the court, but the song was the human, lasting resolution that the law had entirely failed to achieve. The falling of the trapdoor on that somber morning in November 1939 did not merely end the life of Amoah Tweedo Alau. It effectively severed a chapter in the history of American Samoa, leaving behind a scar that would color the island's collective consciousness for generations to come. The execution, intended by the United States Navy as a final, brutal exercise in deterrence, instead became the catalyst for a cultural transformation. The image of the gallows at the customs house, once a functional space for commerce and administration, was forever darkened, transformed into a memorial of a deeply traumatic intersection where local tradition and foreign authority collided with lethal force. The immediate aftermath was a period of profound, heavy silence that descended upon Fagatogo, a communal withdrawal into a space of reflection and shared grief. The naval administration, perhaps satisfied with the clinical efficiency of their act, assumed that the case was now fully closed, filed away in the archives of the military court as a successful demonstration of law and order. However, the reality on the ground was starkly different. The people of Samoa had not been intimidated into silent submission by the sight of the gallows. They had been moved to a state of deep, cultural introspection by the haunting, melodic memory of Amoa's final act of contrition. The song, Fafafaga Samoa, did not disappear into the humid air of the harbor. It took root in the hearts of those who heard it, beginning a long, slow journey from a moment of public execution to a permanent fixture of the island's oral and musical heritage. The long-term consequences of the execution manifested in a gradual, fundamental shift in how the local population viewed the intersection of their lives with the governing power. While the Navy maintained its absolute, iron-fisted control for over a decade following the event, the moral authority of the gallows had been undermined by the very humanity that Amoa displayed in his final moments. The execution ceased to be a symbol of the Navy's power and became, instead, a symbol of the tragic, unnecessary cost of discord and the failure of foreign structures to comprehend the complexities of the Samoan social fabric. As the years passed, the incident became a cornerstone of the island's collective moral education. Mothers and fathers, and later, the community leaders and teachers, would speak of the tragedy not as a story of a criminal being punished, but as a parable regarding the catastrophic potential of unbridled rage and the vital, urgent necessity of maintaining the peace within the extended family structure. The song itself, serving as the bridge between the memory of the crime and the lesson of the atonement, was passed down through the generations, its lyrics serving as an enduring, resonant warning against the abandonment of traditional values. This transformation of the event into a folk lesson meant that the execution had failed in its primary purpose of deterrence, as it did not simply instill fear of the state. It instilled a deep, spiritual reverence for the sanctity of human life and the importance of communal harmony. When the administrative control of American Samoa finally shifted from the Navy to the Department of the Interior in 1951, the island stood on the precipice of a new, complex era. The transition to a civilian-led government allowed for the formal establishment of a local constitution and the eventual, permanent abandonment of the death penalty. The case of Amoa Tweedo Alau stands as the historical finality, the last instance in which the shadow of the rope fell upon the territory, marking the conclusion of a period defined by the rigidity of military rule. The evolution of the legal landscape was not an overnight shift, but a reflection of a broader, deeper understanding that the state's role was not to be a machine of absolute, final punishment, but a foundation for the protection and advancement of the community's welfare. The legacy of the 1939 execution informed this transition, providing a potent, historical argument for a legal system that was more closely aligned with the values and the spirit of the Samoan people. The Customs House, once the nexus of this dark, colonial authority, was eventually recognized as a National Historic Landmark. Today, its structure stands as a testament to a time when the island was forced to navigate the volatile confluence of ancient Polynesian traditions and the sterile, unwavering requirements of an occupying military force. It remains a physical artifact of a period of immense, historical transition, standing silently beside the harbor as a witness to the profound, transformative weight of the events that transpired within its shadow. The most lasting, and perhaps most meaningful, impact of the entire tragedy lies in the enduring, resonant power of the folk music that emerged from the gallows. By transforming the execution from an act of state violence into an act of personal, profound apology, the people of Samoa reclaimed the narrative of the event, stripping the naval authorities of the power to define the finality of Amoa's existence. Many artists, across the following decades, would record their own versions of Fafafaga Samoa, each interpretation keeping the memory of the man and the warning of the song alive for new generations who never saw the gallows themselves. The melody, stripped of its original, traumatic context, became a beautiful, mournful, and deeply respected piece of cultural expression. It is a song that is often performed at community gatherings and formal events, its lyrics serving as an anchor for the values that the islanders hold most dear: the importance of listening, the necessity of patience, the value of family, and the wisdom of temperance. Through this continuous process of remembrance and performance, the case of Amoa has been effectively integrated into the core identity of the island, serving as a permanent, cautionary reminder that even in the darkest, most irredeemable moments of human existence, there remains the capacity for profound reflection and the desire for peace. The history of American Samoa, particularly during the middle of the 20th century, is a story defined by the struggle to maintain cultural integrity while navigating the overwhelming, transformative pressures of an external, foreign presence. The tragedy of Amoa and Sela is the most stark, uncompromising, and deeply personal reflection of this historical era. It is a narrative that resists the simplicity of the official, military reports, which sought to define the crime as an uncomplicated, open-and-shut case of legal transgression. Instead, the story lives on in the oral traditions, in the music, and in the shared memory of the community, where it is understood for what it truly was: a collision of two worlds, a failure of social safety nets, and a heartbreaking, final performance that ultimately sought to heal what had been irrevocably shattered. When one walks through the village of Fagatogo today, beneath the same emerald volcanic peaks that looked down upon the tragedy in 1939, the presence of the past is palpable. The harbor remains a vital center of activity, a place of trade and connection, but the shadow cast by the customs house remains a distinct, historical weight that reminds the visitor of the cost of the order that has since been achieved. The island has moved on, modernizing and integrating into the broader, global community, yet it remains deeply tethered to its history through the stories it chooses to remember. In contemplating the full scope of this narrative, one must arrive at a deep, lingering sense of empathy for the lives that were so violently and suddenly extinguished. There is the tragedy of Sela, the isolated, migrant worker whose life of quiet industry was brought to a brutal, abrupt end far from any familiar support, a man whose death was an irreparable hole in the social fabric of his origin. There is the tragedy of Amoa, a man who possessed a deep, inherent sense of belonging, but who, in a moment of catastrophic, personal failure, allowed his world to descend into a darkness from which he could only emerge through the most severe and final path of atonement. The Naval Administration, too, is a figure in this tragedy, an institution that operated with the cold, unthinking efficiency of its time, ultimately failing to see the humans behind the evidence and missing the opportunity to seek a resolution that could have been more than a mere, final act of vengeance. The story of their intersection remains a haunting, essential piece of American Samoa's historical identity, a reminder that the true character of a place is not found in its administration or its legal mechanisms, but in the people, the stories they tell, and the songs they sing to ensure that the darkest, most painful parts of their past are never truly forgotten. The legacy of Amoa's final song is, ultimately, one of hope, a hope that the lessons learned from the gallows have allowed the island to grow into a place where the humanity of every individual is protected, where communal harmony is guarded with the utmost care, and where the devastating, irreversible consequences of violence serve as an eternal, silent bulwark against the repetition of such profound, historical sorrow. The song continues to drift across the harbor, an enduring, melodic testament that in the heart of Samoa, the voice of the penitent remains stronger and longer-lasting than the silence of the grave, ensuring that while the tragedy was real, its lessons remain a permanent, guiding force for the generations that continue to thrive in the shadow of those green, ancient peaks. The legacy of the tragedy that transpired in Fagatogo in November 1939 is not merely a historical footnote, but a deeply embedded cultural memory that continues to shape the identity of American Samoa. To reflect upon the final moments of Amoa Tuito Elau is to grapple with the profound limitations of state-sanctioned justice and the enduring, irrepressible power of human remorse. The execution at the Customs House, meant to be the ultimate, crushing display of the United States Navy's authority, ultimately failed to silence the voice of the man it sought to extinguish. Instead, by attempting to reduce his life to a matter of legal record and his death to an administrative necessity, the naval authorities created the conditions for a transformation of the event into a legend that transcends the binary of guilt and punishment. The song Who'ThebelepdidIMarry Samoa stands as the primary artifact of this transformation, a melody that carries the weight of a confession and the grace of a final, public absolution. In the decades since the gallows were dismantled and the naval administration transitioned into the structures of civilian governance, the story has been stripped of its sterile, administrative veneer and reclaimed by the community it originally horrified. It is now viewed through a lens of cultural introspection, a narrative that is invoked to reinforce the values of patience, emotional regulation, and the sanctity of communal peace. When we consider the broader impact of this case, we are forced to confront the inherent tension between the imposition of foreign legal systems and the preservation of indigenous communal wisdom. The Fa Amati system, with its emphasis on mediation, restitution, and the restoration of balance, represents a profound, ancient approach to justice that prioritizes the health of the community over the retributive punishment of the individual. The failure of this system to intervene in the conflict between Sela and Emoa is the true tragedy of the incident, representing a rupture in the traditional social fabric that allowed a personal grievance to spiral beyond the point of reconciliation. The naval court, in its clinical focus on the crime as an isolated, linear event, was entirely unable to comprehend or address the underlying cultural context of the dispute. By ignoring the relational dynamics and the social pressures that had led to the violence, the court chose a path of absolute, final punishment that could never truly address the wound that had been inflicted upon the village of Fagatogo. This underscores the fundamental, ongoing challenge of justice in multicultural contexts, the need to respect and integrate indigenous frameworks of reconciliation while ensuring the consistent protection of individual rights. The evolution of the Customs House from a site of colonial authority to a landmark of national historical significance reflects the island's journey towards self-determination and the healing of its collective memory. The physical structure remains, but its meaning has been radically recontextualized. It is no longer an emblem of the Navy's absolute, unchallengeable power. It is a space that marks the transition of American Samoa into a new, complex era of governance and identity. The memory of the gallows serves as a necessary, sobering anchor, a reminder of the fragility of the peace that the community now enjoys. It compels the present generation to reflect on the nature of authority, the morality of state violence, and the vital, enduring importance of keeping the lines of communication open within the extended family and the wider social network. In a world that is increasingly fractured and increasingly prone to the rapid, anonymous escalation of conflict, the lesson of Emoa's song remains remarkably, hauntingly relevant. It serves as a call to acknowledge the devastating, human cost of losing our capacity to listen and our willingness to resolve disputes through understanding and restorative dialogue. Furthermore, the role of the song as a living, evolving piece of folklore ensures that the tragedy does not become a static, cold fact of history, but remains a dynamic, emotional presence in the lives of the people. Each performance of Who'ThebelepdidIMarry Samoa, whether by a formal choir or in a casual, family setting, keeps the narrative active and open to interpretation. It allows the community to engage with the past in a way that is respectful of the victim's loss, acknowledging the profound, irreversible pain of Sela's death, while simultaneously finding a path toward empathy for the man who committed the act. This dual recognition is the hallmark of a mature, culturally grounded approach to tragedy. It avoids the pitfall of romanticizing the criminal while refusing to dehumanize the man, acknowledging that the capacity for both great violence and profound remorse resides within the human heart. The song acts as a bridge across time, allowing the lessons of 1939 to be continually reassessed and applied to the challenges of the modern day. It is an expression of the community's resilience, demonstrating their ability to absorb the trauma of the past and transform it into a source of moral clarity and social cohesion. In analyzing the historical context of the naval administration, it is also necessary to acknowledge the specific, geopolitical realities of the period leading up to the Second World War. The strategic significance of Pago Pago Harbor necessitated a level of military control that was, by its very nature, indifferent to the nuanced social needs of the local population. The Navy was tasked with the preparation of a base of operations, and the preservation of order was paramount to the success of this mission. The case of Amoa, while tragic, was viewed through this administrative, military lens as a problem to be solved with speed and finality. The lack of cultural sensitivity or interest in restorative justice was not necessarily a reflection of malice, but a reflection of the institutional, organizational priorities of a military command in a pre-war environment. This contextualizes the execution as an inevitable, if regrettable, byproduct of a system that was fundamentally unsuited to the needs of the Samoan people. By recognizing the constraints of the administrative power, we can better appreciate the accomplishment of the local community in reclaiming the narrative, moving beyond the institutional frame and into the realm of cultural, humanized memory. Ultimately, the story of Amoa and Sela is an enduring, essential meditation on the nature of human existence in a close-knit, island environment. The geographical constraints of Tutuila act as a constant, pressure-inducing factor that intensifies every interaction and amplifies every conflict. When we view the tragedy through the lens of this confinement, we better understand the desperation that can arise when personal grievances are left to fester without the cooling, moderating influence of the community. The lesson for the future is clear. The strength of a society is measured by its ability to maintain the safety of its most vulnerable members and the integrity of its communal bonds. This requires constant, active participation from everyone, an unwavering commitment to the values of respect and dialogue that protect the island from the darkness of internal strife. The tragedy of the Customs House stands as a silent, powerful monument to this necessity, a reminder that the cost of failure is the loss of life and the permanent, haunting memory of violence. As we conclude this exploration of the final capital case in the history of American Samoa, we are left with a lasting impression of the resilience of the Samoan spirit. The people of the island have not allowed themselves to be defined by the brutality of the 1939 execution, nor have they let the memory of the event fade into obscurity. Instead, they have integrated it into their cultural identity, using it as a source of wisdom and a guide for the ethical navigation of the future. The melody of the final song remains a soaring, haunting presence in the collective memory, a reminder that even in the most desperate of circumstances, there is a path toward repentance and a hope for the restoration of harmony. The legacy of Amoa Tuito Elau is no longer the life he took, nor the life he lost, but the lesson he left behind, a message that continues to resonate across the Pacific, urging all who hear it to cherish the sanctity of life, to hold fast to the bonds of their communities, and to understand that the ultimate power we hold as human beings lies not in our ability to destroy, but in our willingness to listen, to forgive, and to mend the broken fabric of our lives together. The story remains a living, evolving testament to the complexity of the human experience and the enduring, transformative power of remorse, ensuring that the history of American Samoa is recognized not for the violence that once took place, but for the profound, moral evolution that emerged from the shadow of the gallows. To contemplate the finality of the American Samoan capital case is to confront the intersection where the cold rigidity of military law collided with the fluid, resilient spirit of an ancient Pacific culture. Throughout the decades, the narrative of Amoa Tuito Elau has evolved from a chilling report of a maritime administrative execution into a profound, multifaceted lesson in the fragility of human harmony. The act of violence itself, that singular, explosive rupture of peace involving a machete and a solitary migrant worker, has been stripped of its raw, sensationalist elements in favor of a deeper exploration of the psychological and social failures that allowed such a tragedy to take root. We are left not with a simple portrait of a murderer, but with a complex, nuanced study of a man who reached the absolute precipice of his own humanity and, in his final, terrifying descent, found the clarity to offer his own life as a vessel for a moral warning that has resonated through nearly a century of Samoan history. The enduring nature of this case Its refusal to fade into the forgotten corners of naval archives is a testament to the community's decision to own its pain, to process it through the transformative lens of music and oral tradition, and to ultimately ensure that the lessons learned from the gallows are never sacrificed to the indifference of time. Looking back, the naval administration's choice to conduct the execution at the Customs House, at the very heart of the port of Fagatogo, was an act of deliberate, theatrical intimidation. They sought to imprint the image of the gallows onto the consciousness of the islanders, using the stark, vertical lines of the scaffold to represent the uncompromising authority of the United States. Yet, history has shown us that such displays of state power are often ephemeral, easily overwritten by the living, breathing memory of the people they were meant to suppress. The Navy intended to instill a fear of the law. Instead, they inadvertently facilitated the creation of a cultural myth that prioritized the moral weight of the individual's remorse over the physical reality of the state's vengeance. By forcing the community to witness the end of Amoa's life, they forced them to hear the song of his apology, and in doing so, they gifted the island a permanent, haunting, and incredibly poignant cultural artifact that serves as an antithesis to the sterile, clinical violence of the executioner. The song Fafafaga Samoa persists today not as an act of rebellion, but as an act of profound, communal preservation, a way for the people of Samoa to hold on to the humanity that was so nearly erased in the name of legal order. As we traverse the historical landscape of this tragedy, we must also address the silent, often overlooked figure of Sela, the man whose life was so abruptly ended by the machete's blade. In the retelling of the story, there is a clear danger of focusing so intensely on the narrative of the murderer and the legacy of the song that the victim becomes a mere abstraction, a catalyst for the events that followed rather than an individual with his own aspirations, struggles, and inherent worth. To truly honor the history of this case, one must acknowledge the deep, pervasive loneliness that likely defined Sela's existence as an outsider in the village. His death was a violent denial of his right to exist, to work, and to build a life within the community, however alien he may have felt. The failure of the social systems of Fagatogo to reach out to him, to integrate him, and to provide him with the protection afforded to the native-born inhabitants is an essential part of the tragic equation. His memory serves as a sobering reminder of our collective responsibility to ensure that those who dwell on the margins, those who come to our lands seeking labor or refuge, are never left so entirely vulnerable that they become the invisible casualties of local conflicts. The story is not just about the dangers of unchecked rage. It is also about the necessity of radical inclusion and the critical importance of ensuring that no one, regardless of their origin or status, is left without the protection of communal care. Furthermore, the transition of the Customs House from a place of dark, colonial memory to a protected historic landmark provides a unique, reflective space where the past can be reconciled with the present. Visitors to this site can stand in the quiet, humid air of the port and imagine the weight of that November morning in 1939, the presence of the naval officers, the silent, watching crowd, and the haunting, soaring notes of the final song. It is a place that invites a sophisticated, multifaceted engagement with history, where the visitor is not invited to judge the actions of the past from a position of contemporary moral superiority, but to understand the complexities of a time when the world was shrinking and cultures were being forced into new, often destructive, proximity. The site does not preach. It bears witness. It reminds us that history is not a static line of progress, but a shifting, uneven terrain, punctuated by moments of extreme, human error and profound, spiritual recovery. The preservation of this location ensures that the story is not told in a vacuum, but is permanently linked to the physical reality of the island, a constant, tangible presence that commands our attention and our reflection. In the final analysis, the narrative of Amoa Tweedo Alau and the last hanging in American Samoa is a testament to the resilience of human memory and the indomitable power of the human spirit to find meaning even in the most catastrophic, irreversible endings. It is a story that defies the limitations of legal definitions and administrative categories, rising instead to the level of universal, existential drama. The lessons that we derive from this history are as vital today as they were in the waning months of the 1930s. We are reminded that our actions possess a power that far exceeds the immediate physical consequences, that our grievances, if left unattended, can erode the very foundation of our community, and that there is always a potential for redemption, even at the very edge of the grave. The song, which has traveled through time, through the oral traditions of families, through the recordings of musicians, and through the very heart of the island's culture, remains the most powerful tool we possess for keeping the past alive, for learning from our collective mistakes, and for building a future that is more compassionate, more inclusive, and more deeply attuned to the shared humanity that binds us together. We must also recognize that the significance of this case is not fixed, but continues to evolve alongside the island itself. As American Samoa navigates the challenges of the 21st century, the memory of this tragedy provides a moral compass that remains deeply relevant to the social and political questions of the day. The importance of the Fa Amati system, the value of cultural integrity, and the necessity of justice systems that are truly responsive to the people they serve are all themes that are continuously reinforced by the echoes of this story. It is a narrative that challenges us to look inward, to examine the structures that govern our own lives, and to consider whether they truly reflect the values of care, respect, and communal well-being that we claim to hold dear. The legacy of the 1939 execution, therefore, is not just a reflection of the past, but an active, ongoing engagement with the future. It is an invitation to be better, to do better, and to ensure that the tragedy of Fagatogo remains a final, historical outlier, a dark chapter that was closed not by the rope or the trapdoor, but by the resilient, collective effort of a community that refused to let its memory be defined by the violence of the state. As we step away from this deep, analytical immersion into the history of the last capital case, we are struck by the haunting, melodic power that began this journey. The song, in its many forms and interpretations, serves as the true monument to the tragedy, more permanent than stone, more resonant than any architectural landmark. It reminds us that while the state may have the power to take a life, it does not have the power to control the meaning of that life, nor the power to silence the truth of its final, human expression. The case of Amoa Tweedo Alau will continue to be a subject of contemplation, a cornerstone of Samoan folk wisdom, and a profound, living piece of history that continues to remind us that the most powerful force in our world is not the force of law or the force of physical violence, but the force of our own, shared capacity for regret, for healing, and for the creation of beauty out of the most harrowing of circumstances. The melody lingers, echoing against the green, volcanic slopes, a timeless, quiet promise that as long as the people of Samoa remember, the cycle of violence will be met with the greater, more enduring power of human, communal love and the constant, searching quest for a more perfect, more compassionate understanding of what it truly means to live together in peace. Through this understanding, the shadow of the gallows is finally and permanently dispelled, leaving only the clarity of the lesson and the beauty of the song, which continues to guide the way for those who dwell in the heart of the Pacific, ensuring that their collective future is forever informed by the grace and the wisdom of their most haunting past. The finality of the story surrounding Amoa Tweedo Alau, an individual whose name became etched into the dark annals of American Samoa, serves as a bridge between a vanished colonial past and the vibrant, evolving identity of the contemporary Pacific. As we reach the conclusion of this extensive examination, we must synthesize the disparate elements of the tragedy, the brutal act, the cold machinery of naval law, the profound isolation of the migrant worker, and the transcendent beauty of the song, into a comprehensive understanding of why this specific event refuses to be forgotten. The narrative has transcended its origins as a mere criminal report. It has become a living testament to the resilience of a community that was forced to grapple with the ultimate, state-sanctioned violence at a time when its traditional structures were being systematically challenged by foreign influence. The execution in Fagatogo was not a closure of justice, but rather an opening of a deep, historical wound that forced the people of the island to reconsider their values, their social responsibilities, and their relationship to the imposing, often in different mechanisms of external governance. The persistence of the song Fafafaga Samoa acts as the emotional and moral anchor for this reflection, proving that while the physical manifestations of power, the gallows, the handcuffs, the legal decrees, can take a life, they possess no authority over the legacy of the soul or the collective narrative of the people who survive. To analyze this case in its totality, we are compelled to recognize the essential, tragic irony that the naval administration, in their absolute pursuit of an orderly, peaceful territory, created a moment of such profound, lingering dissonance that it disrupted the very order they sought to preserve. By opting for the death penalty, they transformed a local, internal conflict into a monumental spectacle of state violence, an event that became ingrained in the consciousness of the community in ways that no prison sentence or administrative deportation ever could have. The gallows, erected in the middle of the most public and active space in the village, were intended to be a visual deterrent, a chilling, structural warning against the transgression of naval laws. Yet, the presence of these gallows eventually became a symbol of the limitations of the military's own authority, revealing the deep disconnect between the cold, objective requirements of naval discipline and the warm, interconnected, and deeply spiritual needs of the Samoan people. The tragedy lies in this fundamental misunderstanding. The administration saw a crime to be punished, while the people saw life to be mourned and a lesson to be learned. This divergence in perspective is where the true history of the case resides, illustrating the ongoing struggle of colonial and post-colonial societies to reconcile institutional justice with human, cultural reality. Furthermore, the figure of Sela continues to haunt the periphery of our understanding, reminding us that every historical record, no matter how sparse, represents an individual life that was extinguished under the weight of larger, historical forces. In the absence of detailed personal history, his presence is defined by his vulnerability and his ultimate status as the pivot upon which the entire tragedy turned. By honoring his memory, we move beyond the narrative of the execution and into a realm of genuine empathy, acknowledging that the peace of the island was not just threatened by the act of violence, but by the failure of the community to embrace the stranger in their midst. This is perhaps the most difficult, yet most important, lesson to extract from the 19th century archives, that the security of any community is directly dependent on its ability to extend protection, dignity, and inclusion to those who dwell within its borders, regardless of their origin or their social standing. The death of Sela was a profound failure of the collective, a rupture in the bonds of hospitality and empathy that were supposed to define the social life of the island. It challenges us to reflect on our own modern contexts, to ask ourselves who the outsiders are in our own communities, and to ensure that we are not repeating the failures of the past by allowing isolation to manifest as the precursor to further, senseless tragedy. The evolution of the song, from a desperate, final confession on the gallows to a celebrated folk anthem, is the most profound indicator of the community's victory over the trauma of the event. It is a manifestation of the transformative power of art and memory, a process by which a moment of absolute, state-directed dehumanization was converted back into an act of human connection and moral instruction. The song does not hide the crime. It confronts it with honesty and humility. It does not demand acquittal. It asks for acknowledgement and for a change of heart. By singing the song, the people of Samoa are not celebrating the murder, nor are they dismissing the severity of the loss. They are acknowledging the frailty of the human condition and the enduring, vital necessity of maintaining the communal peace. This nuance is precisely what distinguishes the folk tradition from the cold, legalistic record. The legal record is frozen, immovable, and entirely focused on the mechanics of the law, whereas the song is fluid, living, and entirely focused on the growth, redemption, and collective resilience of the people. It is this capacity for evolution and interpretation that allows the history of American Samoa to remain relevant and deeply meaningful to the citizens of today, serving as a beacon of moral guidance in an ever-changing world. When we consider the site of the former customs house in Fagatogo, we are standing in a space that acts as a physical conduit between the past and the present. The landmark serves as a necessary, sobering witness to the transition of the island from a military outpost to a self-governing territory, marking the site where the absolute, final power of the military was displayed with such devastating effect. It is a space of quiet, reflective gravity, a place where the visitor is encouraged to consider the weight of the historical shifts that have defined the island's trajectory. It reminds us that history is not just something we read in books or analyze in academic papers. It is something that is imprinted upon the very ground we stand on, tied to the physical structures of our daily lives, and woven into the stories we pass down to our children. To preserve this site is to ensure that the tragedy of 1939 remains a part of the living memory of the territory, a constant, respectful reminder of the cost of order and the enduring, transformative power of the community's resilience. It is a space for dialogue, for reflection, and for the ongoing process of understanding the complexities of the island's shared history. As this analysis draws to a close, we are struck by the inescapable realization that the case of Amoa Tweedo Alau, despite its grim origins, ultimately points toward a future defined by the virtues of compassion, patience, and the recognition of our shared, fragile humanity. The shadow of the gallows has been effectively dispelled by the light of the lesson, a lesson that has been passed down with meticulous care through the generations. The people of American Samoa have succeeded in turning a dark, historical outlier into a cornerstone of their moral identity, ensuring that the final, capital case in their history is remembered not for the violence that occurred, but for the profound, moral evolution that followed. We are reminded that while the state may have the power to define the law, it is the community that defines the culture, and it is the culture that ultimately shapes the enduring meaning of our history. The melody of the final song continues to echo, a testament to the fact that even in the most harrowing of circumstances, there exists the potential for profound reflection, for the restoration of harmony, and for the creation of a lasting, beautiful legacy that serves to guide the way for all who seek to build a more just and empathetic society. The story is, at its heart, an exploration of the absolute necessity of our connections to one another. It highlights the dangers of the solitary, isolated state and the life-saving potential of a strong, inclusive communal network. It teaches us that our grievances, no matter how deeply felt or how justified they may seem, must always be subject to the tempering influence of the community, the family, and the collective wisdom of those who have navigated the same difficult paths before us. By listening to the voice of the past, we are empowered to make better decisions in our present, to foster environments where peace can flourish, and to remain ever vigilant against the forces of intolerance and indifference that threaten to tear our communities apart. The legacy of this case is therefore not just a reflection on a long-lost moment in the 1930s, but a proactive, vital commitment to the preservation of the values that we hold most dear. It is a reminder that the most significant power we possess is the power to listen, the power to understand, and the power to build a world where the tragedy of Fagatogo remains exactly what it is, a distant, somber, and deeply instructive final chapter of a past that we have collectively and consciously decided to grow beyond. In the final, quiet moments of this narrative, we find a sense of peace that the events of that November morning so cruelly denied. The cycle of trauma has been broken, the memory of the event has been reclaimed, and the song continues to soar, a permanent, melodic triumph of the human spirit over the cold, impersonal finality of the gallows, ensuring that the legacy of American Samoa is recognized for the beauty, the wisdom, and the enduring, compassionate power of the people who call these islands home. The final chapter of this exploration into the history of the last capital case in American Samoa necessitates a synthesis of the profound themes that have emerged from the shadow of the gallows. We have navigated the harrowing transition from an act of visceral, personal violence to the clinical, state-sanctioned finality of the naval execution, and eventually to the enduring, cultural reclamation of the narrative through the power of memory and melody. This journey highlights a fundamental truth about the nature of historical tragedy. The event itself is often only the beginning of a long, complex process of interpretation and integration. The case of Amoa Tweedo Alau, initially processed by the United States Navy as a straightforward matter of military discipline and deterrence, has been transformed by the Samoan people into an essential, moral parable. This transformation is not a distortion of history, but rather an elevation of it, moving beyond the cold, impersonal facts of the crime to address the deeper, more resonant questions of human frailty, the necessity of communal harmony, and the enduring capacity for redemption. The legacy of this case is therefore not defined by the tragedy of the murder or the violence of the execution, but by the remarkable resilience of a community that refused to let its memory be captured by the institutions that once dominated its landscape. At the core of this long-term integration of the tragedy into the Samoan consciousness is the song, Fa'afafega Samoa. It serves as the primary vessel for the preservation of the narrative, providing an emotional and moral anchor that allows subsequent generations to engage with the past in a way that is both intellectually rigorous and deeply empathetic. The song functions as a bridge, allowing the collective experience of the 1930s to inform the ethical landscape of the present. By choosing to remember the execution through the lens of Amoa's song rather than through the administrative record of the naval court, the community has effectively asserted its own agency over its history. This is a powerful, political, and cultural act, one that centers the humanity of the individual and the wisdom of the collective over the clinical, detached authority of the state. It teaches us that the way we remember our darkest moments is just as significant as the moments themselves, and that our ability to derive meaning and instruction from such experiences is what ultimately allows us to transcend the trauma that would otherwise define us. The song remains a living, breathing testament to the fact that even in the face of absolute, state-directed finality, the human spirit retains the capacity for a final, resonant assertion of truth. The administrative structures that once governed Fagatogo, characterized by the rigid, hierarchical, and often detached nature of military rule, have long since given way to the more nuanced, civilian-oriented frameworks of the contemporary government. Yet, the lessons learned from that era remain an essential component of the island's modern governance. The awareness of the risks inherent in a system that prioritizes order over understanding, or that ignores the cultural contexts in which disputes arise, has informed the development of a legal and social architecture that is more deeply embedded in the values and traditions of the Samoan people. The historical realization that a foreign, imposed authority can never fully replace the restorative power of communal mediation is a guiding principle that informs the way the island addresses conflict in the 21st century. By honoring the memory of the 1939 execution, the contemporary community reaffirms its commitment to justice that is not merely punitive, but also restorative, recognizing that the health of the society depends on its ability to heal, to reconcile, and to maintain the sacred harmony of its extended familial ties. This is the positive, forward-looking legacy of the tragedy, a commitment to a future where the darkness of the past is no longer an active threat, but a guiding light that illuminates the importance of human dignity, empathy, and collective care. Moreover, the physical preservation of the Customs House stands as a testament to the importance of maintaining direct, tangible links to our history. It is a space that challenges us to look beyond the surface of our surroundings and to recognize the ghosts of the past that reside in the architecture of our daily lives. It serves as a necessary, sobering counterweight to the rapid pace of modern development, a site that demands we slow down, pay attention, and consider the weight of the historical shifts that have brought us to our current moment. By maintaining this site, American Samoa honors the complexity of its own history, resisting the temptation to sanitize or erase the more difficult, painful chapters. This commitment to historical integrity is vital for any community that seeks to understand itself, as it acknowledges that our identity is not built on a simplified, positive mythology, but on a grounded, honest engagement with the entirety of our lived experience. The site is a place of perpetual, communal instruction, a permanent, silent witness to the evolution of the island and the enduring, transformative power of its shared, cultural resilience. As we look toward the future, the lessons of the last capital case remain as vital and relevant as they were decades ago. The challenges of navigating the complexities of communal life, of managing personal and social conflict, and of ensuring that our institutions remain reflective of our deepest human values are ongoing, permanent tasks for any society. The story of Amoa and Sela provides a clear, unmistakable warning against the dangers of isolation, the corrosive effects of unchecked rage, and the catastrophic, irreversible nature of violence. It also provides a beautiful, inspiring model for how we can move through such pain by turning inward to our communal support networks, by engaging in the difficult, necessary work of reflection, and by finding ways to transform our grief into wisdom. The melody of the final song serves as an enduring guide in this process, a reminder that we are never truly alone if we keep the lines of communication open and if we remain committed to the preservation of the peace that binds us to one another. It is a song that will continue to drift across the harbor of Pago Pago, a timeless, melodic promise that as long as the people remain committed to these values, the tragedy of 1939 will never be repeated. In conclusion, the legacy of American Samoa's last capital case is defined by the community's triumph over the trauma of its own history. The people have succeeded in taking an event that was designed to terrify and intimidate and have transformed it into a cornerstone of their moral identity and cultural pride. This is a testament to the strength of their traditions, the beauty of their oral and musical heritage, and the enduring, compassionate power of their collective spirit. The history of the territory, while marked by this and other difficult chapters, is now defined by its resilience and its commitment to the creation of a future that is shaped by the lessons of the past. As we finish our reflection on this harrowing narrative, we are left with a profound, lingering respect for the way in which the Samoan people have handled their history. They have shown us that even in the face of the most extreme, state-sanctioned violence, the truth of the human experience remains capable of being told, and that the beauty of our expressions of remorse and our commitment to peace will ultimately outlast the cold, impersonal finality of any structure, any law, or any gallows. The legacy is one of wisdom, grace, and an unwavering, hopeful commitment to the betterment of all who call these islands home. The final chapter of this narrative is not written in the cold, dusty pages of a legal report, but in the vibrant, ongoing life of the community, which continues to thrive in the shadow of the peaks, guided by the memory of the past and the enduring, soaring melody of a song that refuses to be silenced by the passing of time, ensuring that the wisdom of the past is forever a part of the vibrant, thriving future of the people of American Samoa. The light of this collective understanding remains the true, final legacy, a beacon that guides the way through the complexities of our shared existence and into a future where the harmony of the community is the ultimate, most cherished, and most enduring triumph of the human heart. The conclusion of our comprehensive exploration brings us to a singular, profound realization. History is rarely defined by the moment of catastrophe, but rather by the subsequent, tireless effort of a community to synthesize that catastrophe into a usable, enduring wisdom. The case of Amoa Tuito Elau, reaching its grim terminus on that November morning in 1939, could have easily remained a sterile entry in a colonial ledger, a forgotten relic of a distant, military-governed past. Instead, through the deliberate, consistent, and deeply emotional labor of generations of Samoan people, it has been elevated into a cultural pillar, a narrative that serves both as a cautionary tale and as a testament to the capacity for human reflection. To reflect on this history is to witness the victory of the oral tradition over the bureaucratic record. While the naval administration relied on the temporary, performative power of the gallows to establish their control, the people relied on the permanent, participatory power of the song to establish their meaning. This contrast is the defining tension of the case, and it is the resolution of this tension that has allowed the story to survive, grow, and ultimately serve the needs of the modern community. We have moved from the visceral, immediate terror of the crime to a contemplative, historical understanding, demonstrating that even the most harrowing episodes can be reclaimed if the community is willing to face them with honesty and a commitment to collective healing. The transition from the 1930s to the present day has been marked by a significant shift in how the territory conceptualizes its relationship with authority, justice, and the sanctity of communal life. In the era of naval administration, the law was an external, imposable force, a set of cold protocols that held little regard for the intricate, social-cultural nuances of the indigenous population. Today, That relationship has been replaced by a system that seeks, however imperfectly, to harmonize the requirements of modern legal standards with the deeply held values of the Samoan people. The memory of the execution acts as a silent, constant presence in this ongoing dialogue, reminding lawmakers, community leaders, and citizens alike that the pursuit of justice must always be tempered by an awareness of its human, social impact. It is a reminder that the law is not an end in itself, but a tool that should be utilized to protect the vulnerable, resolve disputes, and uphold the dignity of every individual, ensuring that the dark, absolute finality of the gallows never again dictates the terms of the island's collective existence. This maturation of the legal and social consciousness is the most significant, tangible outcome of the historical process that began with the execution, providing a framework that is more resilient, more inclusive, and more deeply attuned to the complex needs of the contemporary community. Looking closely at the site of the former customs house today, one finds a space that facilitates a unique, reflective form of public memory. It is a landmark that does not demand our adulation, but invites our consideration. It forces the visitor to slow down, to breathe in the air of the harbor, and to grapple with the reality that this place of trade and international connection was once the stage for a tragic, state-mandated death. This duality is essential to the site's function as a memorial. It does not shy away from the complexity of the past, but embraces it as part of the total experience of the location. By refusing to simplify the narrative, the site serves as an educational tool, encouraging a form of historical literacy that acknowledges the pain of the past while looking forward with a sense of communal responsibility. It is a place that fosters empathy, reminding us that every historical act has a human cost, and that the order we currently enjoy is built upon the lessons learned from those who endured the chaos and tragedy of earlier times. This ongoing, educational function is critical to the preservation of the narrative, as it ensures that the tragedy remains a subject of active engagement rather than a dormant, neglected relic. The persistent power of the song, Fa'afafega Samoa, as a living, evolving piece of folk art also deserves a final, focused consideration. Its longevity is not merely a result of its historical significance. It is a result of its profound, emotional resonance and its ability to adapt to the changing needs of the community. As it is performed today, it carries the weight of the original 1939 tragedy, but it also reflects the contemporary values of a people who have moved beyond that moment. It has become a medium for expressing shared sorrow, a vehicle for moral instruction, and a source of communal identity. In every iteration, the song reaffirms the commitment of the people to the preservation of their cultural heritage and their refusal to let the state's violence have the final word. This is a profound, subtle victory of the community over the military administration, as it demonstrates that the cultural heart of the people remains untouched, capable of finding beauty and meaning even in the most extreme, dehumanizing circumstances. The song acts as a sonic monument, one that is accessible to all, easily shared and permanently etched into the consciousness of every generation, ensuring that the wisdom of the past is not trapped in a book or behind a fence, but is always available to guide the way for those who live in the heart of the Pacific. Furthermore, we must acknowledge the broader, human implications of this story. It is a universal narrative of the dangers of unchecked anger, the risks of social isolation, and the transformative potential of remorse. It speaks to the basic, existential challenge of living alongside one another, of managing our inevitable conflicts, and of ensuring that our institutions are capable of addressing our failings without stripping us of our humanity. The case of Amoa and Sela is an extreme, intensified version of the conflicts that exist in every human society, and therefore, its lessons are globally applicable. It reminds us that no community is immune to the potential for tragedy, and that the only true defense against such outcomes is the active, continuous investment in our social bonds, our systems of communication, and our collective commitment to the sanctity of life. By studying this specific case, we're not just looking at a moment in Samoan history. We are looking at a mirror that reflects the ongoing, universal struggle to build and sustain a just, empathetic, and peaceful world. The tragedy of Fagatogo provides a clear, unmistakable blueprint for the risks we face when we fail in this struggle, and a clear, hopeful guide for the path toward redemption when we succeed in facing our failures with courage and humility. As we reach the final moments of this investigation, we are left with an overwhelming sense of the continuity of the Samoan spirit. The people have honored their history, not by dwelling in the bitterness of the past, but by synthesizing it into a foundation for their future. The tragedy, while real and profound, has been effectively channeled into the creation of a society that values its heritage, respects its traditions, and maintains an unwavering commitment to the preservation of peace. The shadow of the gallows, once so long and so pervasive, has been entirely lifted, replaced by the light of a community that understands its own strength, honors its own memory, and continues to move forward with a clarity of purpose that is both inspiring and deeply human. The story of Amoa Tuito Elau will continue to echo through the peaks and across the harbor, a timeless, melodic reminder of the power of the human heart to find its way through the darkest of nights and to emerge, eventually, into the steady, calm, and hopeful light of a new day. This is the ultimate, final, and most enduring triumph of the people of American Samoa, a testament to the fact that while history may be marked by moments of deep, irreparable sorrow, the future is always ours to shape with the lessons we have chosen to carry forward. The legacy is now ours to contemplate, to carry, and to pass on, ensuring that the wisdom gained from the tragedy of Fagatogo remains a vibrant, active, and guiding force in the lives of those who come after us. It is a story that has reached its proper, historical conclusion, not in the silence of an execution, but in the resonant, life-affirming sound of a people who have chosen to remember, to learn, and to thrive in the face of their own past. We leave this narrative with a final, deep, and abiding respect for the resilience of the human spirit, for the enduring power of communal memory, and for the simple, profound truth that in the end, it is the songs we sing, the stories we tell, and the values we uphold that define our true, historical reality. May the melody of the song continue to guide the people of American Samoa, and may the lessons of the tragedy remain a permanent, silent bulwark against the return of such profound, historical darkness. The journey from the 1930s to the present day is a journey of redemption, a transition from the cold, mechanical application of the law to the warm, restorative, and deeply human embrace of the community, and in this transition, we find the true, final, and most hopeful legacy of the entire, complex, and deeply human story. This conclusion marks the final, definitive resolution of the narrative, a closing of the chapter that honors the victim, reflects on the perpetrator, and celebrates the profound, lasting, and triumphant spirit of the community that refused to let its history be anything other than a testament to the power of human life and the sanctity of the peace that we all so desperately seek to protect and to sustain for all time.